Chapter 27 of Old Farm Fairies, a summer campaign in Brownieland against King Cobweaver's Pixies, by Henry Christopher McCook. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Catherine Arwine. The Disenchantment. Lieutenant McWhirlie had now almost come to doubt so much of his theory as located the unknown enemy within the picket line. But he was a persistent person and disliked to give up his theory until he had something better to lay hold of. Moreover, as he still believed the Pixies to be the cause of the late misfortunes, and as he knew that they were wont to be quite active about the peep of day, he resolved to bide by his voluntary watch a little longer. He beckoned Sergeant Vigilant to his side, and the two sat down to rest among the delicate ferns that covered the ridge. They went over again the events of the night, putting this and that together in order to frame some intelligent theory for their guidance. McWhirlie, however, could find nothing to shake his first conclusion.
"The danger must have come upon them unawares," said he. "It was clearly, in every case, a complete surprise. If an enemy had approached from the front, he would have been spied in time for an alarm. A surprise so thorough could only have come from the direction of our own camp, as that was the only quarter not carefully watched."
The sergeant's reply was arrested by a curious phenomenon. The ground beneath them seemed to be trembling. It raised slowly, swayed back and forth, and then sank down. The Brownies jumped to their feet, and McWhirlie exclaimed,
"What is that? Did you notice the shaking of the earth, or was it only the grass rocking in the wind?"
It seemed to be an earthquake," answered Vigilant. "There, I feel the ground again trembling beneath us." The earth had indeed begun to lift up like a wave. Higher and higher it rose, until the officers, finding that they were losing their perpendicular, flung themselves backward, in true Brownie fashion, into a bush on the summit of the ridge.
"See," cried McWhirlie,
clasping the sergeant by the arm.
"There is the enchantress of your haunted ground."
A trap door had opened in the ground, and out of the crevice a huge chocolate-brown pixie was stealthily peeping. The door was semicircular in form, its edge beautifully beveled and covered with fine white silk and fitted into the ground as smoothly as a cork into a flask. The top was covered with grass and ferns of the same kind as those on the ridge, so that the keenest eye could not detect the difference. A hinge of strong silk cloth held the trapdoor to the upper side of the ridge. All this the Brownies took in at a glance. They crouched motionless in the bush, concealed by the leaves, but having a full view of the monster who was slowly emerging from the tubular burrow under the trap. The creature was the largest of the pixie race that either of the officers had seen. She was several times the size of Spite or Hyde, and compared to the Brownies, was as an elephant to a child. She was covered with a fur robe of a uniform brownish-red color, fringed with black. Her fangs were huge tusks, her feet immense brushes armed with sharp claws. Woe to the enemy that fell within her power. The Brownie officers had as brave hearts as ever beat under uniform, but the wonder upon their faces was somewhat touched with terror as they looked from this monster into each other's eyes. There could be no mistake about it. This was the great giantess, Kitaniza, the queen of the Pixies. The giantess turned, clambered up the ridge, and made straight for the bushlet wherein the Brownies were hid. They grasped their swords and silently waited. Kitaniza reached the bush. She stretched up an arm to seize the Brownies? No. She fastened a strong cord to a twig and pulled it taut. The trapdoor of her cave slowly raised until it stood ajar. Then another line was made fast to the bush and carried over to the top of the door. The trap swung in this wise, and thus allowed the Pixie Queen to enter her den when she wished to return. This done, she went down the ridge, gazed around her, and began spreading a thick snare over the ground round about the trapdoor. She had not seen the Brownie officers at all.
"We are safe this time," whispered McWhirlie to Vigilant. "But what shall we do? It would be folly for two of us, or even the whole guard, to attack that creature without some great advantage on our part."
"We must wait and watch," was the answer. "Our action must depend upon the Pixie Queens."
"Aye, aye," responded the lieutenant. "But there is one thing I have settled. These cords shall be cut, and the monster shut out from her den. If there is any hope at all for the recovery of our captain and comrades, it lies in that. Come what may, the giantess shall never get back into her cave, at least until we have had a chance to explore it."
Queen Kitanisa had by this time finished her snare of strong cords, and a smooth silken sheet stretched irregularly upon the grass. She gazed contentedly upon her work, cast a glance upon her trap-door swinging snugly by its lines, and set off in the direction of the Pixie camp. She stopped suddenly. She had caught sight of one of the sentinels in the outer circle of the guards, and at the same moment the sentinel saw her. He lifted his bugle and sounded the alarm. "Tra! Tra-la-la-la!" The answer came like an echo from a score of bugles, and the air was full of the notes. Kitanisa turned and ran toward her cave. McWhirlie heaved up his axe and struck a double-handed blow. One of the lines which held up the trap was severed. Again he struck. The second line parted, and down fell the trap with a heavy thud, just as the giantess reached it. She was shut out from her cave. A glance showed her the cause of her misfortune, and then her huge form shook with rage. She leaped upon the ridge, but by this time the Brownie officers were well away in hot flight, and the circle of guards was rapidly closing around them. A stir throughout the Brownie camp beyond showed that a general alarm had been sounded, and the whole army was falling into line. But could the devoted officers and their little band escape destruction? "Stand!" cried McWhirlie. He himself stopped short in his flight and faced toward Kitanisa, who was pressing forward with uplifted claws and clattering tusks. Vigilant stopped and stood beside his lieutenant. The sentinels gathered around them, scarce a dozen of them. It seemed as if the Pixie might crush them all at a blow. "Attention!" called the lieutenant. "There is but one chance left us. We must skirmish with this monster as best we can until the troops come up. Mark those bushes to the right and left. Ready, bolt!" McWhirlie gave these commands in sharp, rapid tones that seemed to impart his own spirit to the sentinels. Kitanisa had approached within half a bowshot of the lieutenant as the final order was given. At the word vault, every Brownie disappeared into the foliage of the bushes to right and left, and there, perched on the outer leaves with bows and spears in hand. The giantess paused and stood with raised arms, rampant and threatening. She panted with anger and exertion. She looked to this side and that, before her, behind her, but saw no sign of her enemies. From the top of a tall clump of grass above her, McWhirlie's voice called, "Fire!" Kitanisa started. A lance had struck her face. An arrow had cut through her shaggy robe and broke flesh upon the abdomen. A dozen other weapons bounded back harmlessly from the chest or frayed the skin upon arms and legs. She leaped upon the clump of grass whence McWhirlie had issued the order. The stalks bent down so quickly under the great weight that the bulky creature sprawled upon the ground. The lieutenant was shaken from his perch and rolled in the dust beside the Pixie, but at once regained his feet. "Rally!" he cried, and the soldiers ran to his side. Kitanisa now stood looking at her tiny foes. It seemed like a battle between a lion and a litter of mice, so vast was the difference in size between the combatants. In this moment of peril to the devoted band, there was a new arrival upon the scene. Ensign Law, having left camp for Hillside, the command of the cavalry fell to Sergeant Goodnews when McWhirlie came into chief command after Bruce's disappearance. Goodnews was one of the most famous among the Brownie officers. There was not a fairy in the whole nation so comely in appearance, so valiant in fight, so efficient in all military action, so wise in counsel, so cheerful, amiable, and kind in disposition. Never were beauty and sweetness so well combined with valor and might. His charger was a goodly-sized wasp, whose name was Formosa, commonly shortened into the nickname of Mose. The creature was thoroughly trained, apt in every duty of war, and devoted to her master. In motion, she was the swiftest of all the troop. She had a complete armor and carried a spear charged with a deadly sting, which she well knew how to use against her master's foes. This was the new arrival. Hurrying up behind Good News came a squad of mounted Brownies, and beyond these again the remainder of the army. But they would be too late. What could one soldier do, however brave and well mounted, to save the Brownie sentinels from the monster who was in the act of throwing herself upon them? We shall see. As the giantess sprang upon the little group of guards, a volley of arrows and spears flew into her face. But these wrought small harm, and ere the sentinels could leap aside, 3 of them had been torn to pieces. Vigilant was wounded and borne to the earth. McWhirly was disarmed and dashed to one side, bruised and sorely bedraggled. It was at this moment, when the giantess was turning fiercely upon her prostrate foes, that Good News flew to the rescue upon his gallant Formosa. His saber cut clean and strong across Quitaniza's eyes as he passed at full speed. He wheeled and rode back again. What is he doing? He is hovering above the Pixie Queen, skillfully avoiding all her mad efforts to grapple with him. Is he only seeking to turn her attention from his friends? At least he is making no attempt to use his saber. Ah, his tactics are plain enough now. Formosa circles around the dazed giantess a moment, and then darts upon her back. The wasp's bright lance flashes in the light. Then horseman and steed are away again like the wind. And what is this? Quitaniza reels upon her feet. She has fallen over upon her face. She is motionless. The fatal armor of Sergeant Goodnews's good nag has done the work. The poison within the sting ran instantly throughout the bulky frame of the Pixie Queen, and there she lay, prone and powerless. "Hurrah!" shouted McWhirly, leaping up in spite of his bruises and gaily swinging his broadsword. "We are saved. The Queen is dead. We can save the captain now. If." Ah, that if. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Old Farm Fairies, a summer campaign in Brownieland against King Cobweaver's Pixies, by Henry Christopher McCook. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Catherine Arwine. Out of the Pit. The dayspring had begun to streak the east when McWhirly, with a chosen band of Brownies, stood again before the closed trap door of Quitaniza's cave. The silken cords which had held the door open were still clinging to it. The ends which the lieutenant had cut away were now gathered up, and the Brownies vainly sought to pull the door open by main strength. "Away!" bade McWhirly. "Call another company to our aid, and send a windlass." Soon a second company arrived, bringing ropes and a windlass. The latter was a rough machine, a straight twig resting within 2 upright forked twigs and having spokes thrust into and around its projecting ends. The windlass was planted on the ridge, a cord wound around the twig, and fastened at the free end to moss growing upon the trap door. A bevy of Brownies seized the spokes and began pushing and pulling with might and main. Some took the ends of the spokes and threw themselves downward, carrying the windlass around by their momentum. Others braced their backs against one another and with feet upon the spokes pushed right merrily. Brownies are apt to make a frolic of their work, and even on an occasion so serious, their capers could not be quite suppressed. The 2 ropes were also fastened to the trap door and manned by a troop of soldiers. A cheery call went up from the lieutenant. "Hi-yo! Pull away!" The Brownies at the ropes responded in a sort of chant. "He-oh! A long pull! He-oh! A strong pull! He-oh! A pull all together! Oh!" At each cadence, the busy workers put forth all their strength. The trap began to move. Higher, higher. It was soon fairly above the ground. Workers were stationed below to thrust props into the opening as the door rose. A goodly distance was cleared at last. New props were added. The trap stood ajar, and the mouth of the burrow was exposed to view. "Now, men," said McWhirlie, "this is my adventure. I shall lead the way into the pit. Sergeant Rise and Corporals Hope and Shine shall go with me. Let the rest be ready for any order or emergency. Bring ladders and lanterns." Both were ready. The rope ladders were hung upon the edge of the burrow, one on each side. McWhirlie stepped upon one, battle-axe in hand, and was followed by Corporal Shine. Sergeant Rise led the way upon the other, followed by Corporal Hope. "Ready?" asked the lieutenant. "Ready." "Come on, then, and mind the signals." Hope and Shine had ropes fastened to their bodies, by which signals could be sent aloft. They also had their bugles hung loosely, with which to sound the alarm and give necessary orders. Down, down into the cave the Brownies went. The light of day was left behind them. All was dark, except where the lanterns shed a narrow circle of light. A cry of horror broke from McWhirlie. On the sides of the cave hung the forms of 2 Brownies. They were fastened by silk ropes to the silken lining of the tunnel and swung stark and cold. They were dead. "Who are they?" cried Hope as he peered through the glimmering light to recognize, if possible, the dead sentinels. "Is the captain there?" The explorers' hearts were very heavy. It was sad enough however it might turn out, but oh, if their beloved leader should come to this end. "Is it the captain?" echoed Rise and Shine. McWhirlie, who was nearest the swinging corpses, had been scanning them closely. He made out the one nearest him. "This is Sharpsight, beyond a doubt. The other is—" "Well, the other?" In the dim light, it was difficult to determine. Bruce and Standwile were very like in form and stature, and there were few marks in the Brownie uniform by which men could be distinguished from officers. "It is Standwile." The decision was given slowly, but confidently. Yes, the sentinels were gone, but the captain was yet to be found. "We must send our poor comrades aloft," said McWhirlie, "before we go further. Pull the signal rope, Hope, and have the ladder shifted a little nearer the bodies." Hope was soon aloft and down again. The ladder was shifted, the dead sentinels fastened to the ropes, and hoisted slowly out of their charnel house. Down in the cave, the groans and cry, with which the corpses of their comrades were greeted, were heard by the little band of devoted explorers. Once more, the ropes were lowered, were fastened as before, and the Brownies pushed on in the darkness. They reached the bottom of the cave at last. Not a sound was heard save the echoes of their own voices in the hollow depth. There were carcasses of huge insects and legs, wings, and heads thereof scattered over the floor. The Brownies stumbled over these at every step. Not a sign of the captain. Around and around they went, sounding the walls with their axes, cutting away the silken tapestry here and there. There was clearly but one chamber, no secret doors or inner rooms at that point at least. "Then we must look higher up," said the lieutenant. "There must somewhere be a branch tunnel in which the captain, living or dead, has been stored away. Look sharp, my men." Up they clambered, scrutinizing at every round the circular wall of the cave. They reached the point where the dead sentinels had hung. Some unevenness in the surface here caught McWhirlie's quick eyes. He struck the end of his battle axe upon the wall. Hark! There was a faint echo within. The place was hollow. He smote again. A third time the axe fell, but ere it reached the wall, a door opened so violently that it struck and put out the lantern in the lieutenant's hand. Fortunately, as it proved, the axe blade fell upon the bevel of the door and was thereby wedged into the opening, leaving the door slightly ajar. "What is it?" cried Rise. "One of the brood of the Pixie Queen," answered the lieutenant. "I caught a glimpse of the creature's claw and fangs as the trap door opened. It is a young giant. Our captain is inside this branch, and this pixie prince is guarding him. Here, lay hold of the trap." Rise and Hope joined their comrades upon the ladder. Slits were cut in the tapestry, and seizing the fragments, the Brownies tugged with utmost strength to pull open the door. It was hung so loosely that it ought to have opened almost of its own weight, yet the Brownies could not move it. "The prince is holding it against us," said McWhirlie. "We must have help from above. Quick, fasten these ropes into the slits upon the door. There, that will do finely. Now, aloft, Hope. Let the men above pull upon these ropes. Brace them back when you find them giving way enough, and fasten them firmly. Then descend, and bring my two-edged sword with you, Old Charity." These orders were obeyed with amazing rapidity. Hope inspired his fellows with the news that the captain might yet be found, but withal there was a cloud upon many faces. It seemed hard to be up there pulling at ropes while a blow was to be struck for their captain's liberty. And then was their noble lieutenant, their leader now, to risk his life in that cave with so few to support him. The Pixie Prince was a youth, it was true, but a giant nevertheless, and a match for a whole company of the best Brownies. The messenger, who had gone down with McWhirlie's sword, returned with an order that pacified this discontent. 2 more ladders were to be let down into the cave. Over these, soldiers were to be stationed as closely as convenient. Thus, there were 2 lines of Brownies reaching from the surface of the earth to the mouth of the branch, all ready for any service and in communication with the troops above. These arrangements were soon made. Then came the signal, "Hoist away!" The ropes tightened. The door began slowly to yield. McWhirlie stood upon the ladder close by the edge of the trap, holding the side ropes with one hand and grasping his 2-edged sword in the other. The Pixie's black claws came into view. They were fastened upon the inside cover of the trap, and the whole weight and strength of the young giant were opposing the opening. "Ah, take that then!" cried the lieutenant, striking upon the exposed claw, which was thus nearly severed from the arm. The giant released his hold and backed slowly up the branch. By this time, the trap door had been well nigh lifted up from the wall and was held steady by the ropes above, which were securely fastened. McWhirlie entered the open door of the branch, followed closely by Shine, Rise, and Hope. "Fasten your lanterns to the sides," said McWhirlie. There were hooks on the handles for such uses, which, by a single motion of the hand, were caught into the silken lining, and thence the foxfire lights threw their glow into the darkness. Sword in hand, the 4 Brownies advanced, the lieutenant in front. The bulky form of the Pixie Prince opposed them. They stood a moment, silent and prayerful, ere closing to the conflict. They knew that their lives hung in the balance and girded themselves for the issue. Back from the inner darkness, in that momentary waiting, a voice called faintly, "Halloo! Hark, my men, it is the captain," cried McWhirlie, waving his sword while the cave fairly rang with his answering shout, "Hello!" Again the voice came, stronger than before, saying, "Who is there?" It was indeed the voice of Bruce. "Brownies," answered the 4 men in chorus. "Brownies to the rescue." They threw themselves upon the Pixie, smiting face and breast, arms and legs with swift, strong blows. Prince Proud, for that was his name, made but a feeble resistance. Once or twice he stretched out his arms as though to grapple with his assailants, But the Brownies easily avoided him, and springing forward again, showered their sharp blows upon the huge foe. The cause of this apathy was soon explained. He was just over a season of molting, or changing his skin. Several times before they are grown, pixies go through this strange process. The whole outer skin peels off. During the change, the creatures are almost helpless and lie still, taking little or no food. After the skin is off, it takes several days for them to regain their strength. During the whole time of this change, nothing but the sorest need can stir them up to even as great exertion as Proud had already made. McWhirlie saw his advantage at once. He understood how they had escaped thus far so easily. His hopes rose into confidence. He spoke with new cheer. "Forward, merrily! Sergeant, rise! Order in the men who are on the ladders. I shall cut my way past the Pixie to the captain." He struck upon the prince's face as he ran forward, gave a backhanded stroke as he passed, and then fairly dodged under Proud's legs and passed on into the darkness. "Captain!" he called. "Captain!" "Here," was the answer from the far end of the cavern, in the well-known voice of dear old Bruce. "This way, whoever you are. I am bound hand and foot." On into the darkness the lieutenant ran, thinking nothing and caring nothing for obstacles. The little light at the mouth of the cave was shut out from the interior by Proud's huge body, but guided by the voice, McWhirlie strode on through the gloom and fairly stumbled at last upon his captain's prostrate form. In a moment, the keen edge of charity had cut the silken cords with which Bruce was swathed, and the strong arms of McWhirlie lifted him to his feet. "Who is it?" cried the captain, with trembling voice. "It is I, McWhirlie." And throwing his arms about the captive's neck, the brave dragoon sobbed for joy. Suddenly, the darkness of the cave was broken by a flood of light that relieved even the shadows of that end of the cavern where Bruce had lain. McWhirlie turned. Proud was gone. The Brownies at the mouth of the cave were in great confusion, some sprawling upon the floor, some scrambling to their feet, some swinging by the roof, some hanging to the raised trap-door, and some to the mouth of the cave. In the excitement of the moment, McWhirlie let go his hold upon the captain. The limbs of the unfortunate chief were so benumbed by his severe handling and the tightness of the ropes with which he was bound that he fell upon the floor. "Oh, my poor captain!" exclaimed McWhirlie. "Pardon my thoughtlessness." Without more ado, he lifted the fallen officer in his arms and started toward the cave's mouth. Rise, Hope, and several others were already hurrying inward to find their officers. They met McWhirlie midway of the cavern, staggering under his burden. A shout of joy burst from their lips at the sight. It was subdued at once as the noble fellows caught sight of their leader's pale face. But the note had gone on from lip to lip, out of the branch tunnel, up the walls of the main cavern, along the line of soldiers who hung upon the ropes, to the group who gathered around the open door. The sentinels caught up the cry. It flew from man to man until it reached the camp, and then, led by the sound of trumpets and the blast of bugles, the whole wood and valley rang with such a cheer as never before went up, even from Brownie throats. "Hurrah! Rejoice! Our lost is found!" The squirrels stopped upon the branches of the trees, threw their bushy tails above their backs, pricked up their tiny ears, listened a moment, then joined in the cry of their friends with merry barking. The birds stopped in their flight or alit upon the boughs, perked their pretty heads to this side and that, as though they were asking, "What is the matter?" Then they too joined in the shout of their good friends the Brownies, whistling, trilling, caroling, until the air was alive with songs. The trees clapped their leaf hands together. The flowers raised their plumed hats. The bees, butterflies, and wasps hummed in chorus with the joyful cry. It seemed as though all nature had joined in with their happy friends to celebrate the rescue of Bruce, chief of the Brownies, and happiest heart of all was that of Agatha the Good. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Old Farm Fairies, a summer campaign in Brownieland against King Cobweaver's Pixies, by Henry Christopher McCook. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Catherine Arwine. Breaking Camp. The rescued Bruce was carried by his rejoicing friends and followers to the upper air. The fresh breeze and bright sunshine wrought like a charm to renew his strength. The time of his captivity had been short, but he had been so roughly handled by his giant captors, and the cords with which he had been bound had so galled him that he was quite unable to walk. He was therefore laid upon a leaf stretcher and carried to his tent. A few words explained the manner of his capture. He had been surprised by the giantess, who rushed upon him from behind, knocked him senseless by a blow of her claw, bound him, and then carried him into her den. The monster had already slain the 2 sentinels, sucked their blood, and hung the bodies upon the wall where they had been found. But Bruce was reserved to feed the maw of Prince Proud, and was therefore thrust into the branch cave. As, however, the worthy youth was molting and in the listless estate which has been described, the captain lay in bonds awaiting the revival of Proud's appetite. To this fact, both Bruce and his gallant rescuers owed their lives. But what became of Proud? The lieutenant naturally raised this question after all the party had gone out of the cave. Well, said Sergeant Rise, laughing, he's down there among the bones at the bottom of the cave, alive or dead, I don't know which. After you had dodged by the prince, we attacked him vigorously, but he did little more than move back slowly, occasionally striking out in a blind way. All at once, however, he dashed forward and plunged out of the branch into the bottom of the main cave. We were taken by surprise and were sent flying in all directions in an awkward and ludicrous manner. A score or so of brownies had just entered the branch from the ladders, and they were scattered like leaves in a whirlwind. 2 of them were thrown upon the Pixie's shoulders and went down with him pickaback into the cavern. Fortunately, they flung themselves off upon the rope ladders and so escaped. Indeed, we all got off pretty well. A few scratches, bruises, and torn clothes, but nothing serious. It was about the funniest scrape we have been in for a long time. We were taken aback and upset by the brute's sudden dash. McWhirly joined in the hearty laughter which the recital of the adventure awakened. However, my lads, said he, it might have been anything but a comic affair. See that the trapdoor is securely lashed and fastened down and guarded. We will look after the young giant hereafter. This order given, the lieutenant was about following his captain to the camp when his attention was drawn to a crowd of curious brownies gathered around the carcass of the Pixie Queen. Ah, yes, said he. I must see about getting this thing out of the way. He climbed into a bush from which he could overlook at once the crowd and the bulky form of the giantess. The greater part of the brownies were gazing upon the carcass, meanwhile chatting in their lively way over late events. A small group of more restless spirits were bent upon getting the fangs or tusks of the immense creature as trophies. They had just finished their arrangements as McWhirly arrived, and armed with ropes, swords, and axes, were scrambling over Kitaniza's legs toward her face. The legs and arms were drawn up around the body as they had been when death overtook her. Suddenly, the arms stretched forward from the face. The legs shot out backward. Whoo! The Pixie Queen has come to life, someone shouted. Such a scampering as there was. The adventurous trophy seekers threw themselves by a series of somersaults from the moving limbs, and brownies, axes, swords, and ropes went flying in all directions through the air. The crowd around fell back, pushing, tumbling, clambering over one another, a panic-stricken mass. McWhirly, from his lookout, observed this strange behavior of a dead pixie with amazement and alarm. "What? Isn't the giantess dead?" he exclaimed. He expected to see her rise and charge upon the confused and struggling crowd of brownies, but ere he could give a second thought, Kitaniza's limbs slowly fell back into their first position. She made no other motion. The soldiers rapidly recovered from their panic when they found they were not pursued. Then, in right Brownie fashion, began to make merry over their own ridiculous flight. But what were they to think of this last movement of the Pixie? Wasn't the creature dead? McWhirly left his perch and took charge of affairs. He was about organizing a fresh attack upon the giantess when Sergeant Goodnews rode up astride his nag, Formosa. He had already heard of the strange behavior of the corpse and was ready to explain. The fact is, Lieutenant, that Pixie is not dead, but you would quite waste your energies in any new attack upon her. She will surely die. The sting of my mows is mortal, but for several days, perhaps weeks, Kitaniza will be just as you see her. She cannot move from that spot. If you disturb her, she will probably stretch out her limbs, but they will fall back again without doing any harm, and in due time, the creature will die. The Brownies were satisfied, although the explanation seemed very strange, but they had well learned that nature's facts are often stranger than fiction, and so believed the good sergeant. The giantess was left undisturbed, and McWhirly hastened to camp. Captain Bruce rapidly recovered his spirits, but his nerves had received too severe a shock to allow him to resume active command at once. Yet he could consult with his officers as to what should now be done, and a council of war was held in his tent. The reluctant conclusion was that it would be better to raise the siege of Orchard Cave and join the fleet at the inlet. They feared that the enemy might attack the Brownie forces while divided and destroy them. The order was therefore given to break camp at once. Amid the stir of preparation for departure, McWhirly had forgotten about the dead giantess. But as the Brownie troops marched by the late scene of conflict on their way to the inlet, he was reminded of the incident by a cry from the vanguard. "The body of the Pixie Queen is gone!" "Is it possible?" "Call Sergeant Goodnews." The sergeant reported immediately. "How is this, Sergeant? It seems that you were wrong about that giant foe. She has disappeared. The Brownies haven't carried her off. The Pixies haven't been near her. She must have made off herself. You surely did not mean to deceive us, but explain if you can." The sergeant gave reins to Mose, and followed by McWhirly on his bee-pony Buzz, flew straight to the spot where Kitaniza had lain. The bulky carcass was nowhere to be seen. "Now, my good Mose," said the sergeant, "show us what you know of this mystery." The obedient wasp circled around the spot, and then darted into the bushes. She soon lit upon an overhanging twig and folded her wings as though quite contented with herself. "What is the matter now?" cried McWhirly. "Look for yourself," said Goodnews, pointing to the ground beneath. A mound of fresh earth was thrown up on the margin of a wide hole, out of which came the sound of rattling clods and fluttering wings. "What is this? It explains nothing." "Wait a wee. There, do you see that?" A large pompous wasp flew out of the hole, which she at once began to fill with the loose clay heaped around the edge. "That is your sexton," said Goodnews. "This is her newly made grave, and inside you will find the missing body. The sexton is a full cousin of my Formosa. She has dragged your giantess here by her own unaided strength, has dug that grave which you see, and is just ready to fill it up. Are you satisfied? If not, look for yourself." Down flew McWhirly to the edge of the grave. Away went the sexton in alarm. The lieutenant peeped into the hole and saw the brown body and limbs of the Pixie Queen already partly covered with pellets of clay. "I am satisfied," he said, and the two rode away. "But tell me, what strange fancy could have turned yon insect into an amateur grave digger?" "It is not a matter of fancy," replied Goodnews, "but of those strong, wise, natural promptings of motherhood, which men call maternal instinct. If you had lifted one of the Pixie's limbs, you might have found an egg of the wasp snugly stowed away against the body. In due time, that egg will become a grub with a most ferocious appetite, and that appetite will find food in the plump body of the Pixie Queen. That is why nature has given some wasps the power to paralyze by their sting the prey which they stow away as food for the future grub. It remains fresh and palatable instead of decaying as it would do in actual death. When the lieutenant again reached the head of the column, it was about passing the trapdoor cave. The Brownie guards were relieved from duty, and Prince Proud was left to his fate. As the trap had been pretty tightly fastened down, however, the Brownies had good hopes that his fate would be such as to deliver them from any further fear on his account. It was a pretty sight to see the Brownie troops as they marched to the inlet. First came the cavalry, their bright trappings and many-colored butterfly steeds making a brilliant spectacle. Next to these rode Sergeant Goodnews with the color guard, as McWhirlie was once more at the head of his troopers, and Ensign Law was still absent. The great flag of Brownieland was borne by a sturdy dragoon, mounted on a Goliath moth. Behind these came the litter on which Captain Bruce was carried. A small, downy leaf of silver maple had been laid upon a mattress woven out of ropes of grass and fibers of bark. The mattress was slung upon poles on each side, and these were laid upon the shoulders of stout Brownies, who thus carried their beloved captain quite comfortably. Above the litter, a sunshade, made from the blossoms of a wood violet, was borne by mounted Brownies. Behind this ambulance, and indeed directing it, rode the nurses, Agatha and Grace, with the assistants and accoutrements of the sanitary corps. The maidens were pale and worn by the grief and excitement of the last days, and rode along sadly, almost silently. A number of litters followed the sanitary corps, bearing sick and wounded Brownies. Then came the infantry, and last of all, a squad of cavalry brought up the rear, the buglers piping merry notes as they rode along. The Brownie army did not get away without annoyance from the enemy. The Wolf Brigade and the Vaulters hung upon the rear and flanks, annoying the troops as much as possible. Gossamer and his balloon corps hovered above, keenly spying the column to note where an assault might be made. The Wheel Legion spun cobwebs across the route to entangle the wings of the cavalry. The line weavers and tube weavers spread thick sheets upon the grass to retard the footmen's progress. The Stygian ships followed the line of march as nearly as might be, keeping close inshore and watching for opportunity to work harm. The watermen, smugglers, and pirates pushed out from their grassy hiding places and joined in the pursuit. The Brownies, however, were quite used to all these methods of assault and knew well how to meet and avoid them. Moreover, a section of their flying artillery, with guns mounted upon bee-ponies, accompanied the march. They hovered over the van and rear and above either flank of the column and pelted their adversaries with shot from their portable Davids, thus keeping them at a safe distance. Before sunset, the inlet was reached, and the army encamped safely under protection of the big Davids mounted upon the forts built at either cape. One of these was known as Fort School, the other Fort Home, and the guns which guarded these were called Precept and Example, for Brownies are fond of calling all manner of objects after some favorite fact, person, or virtue among their human friends. It was pleasant for the soldiers and sailors once more to be together, and there were warm greetings and happy reunions. But as they pitched their tents and kindled their campfires on the beautiful and familiar bank of their beloved stream, their hearts were sad that their foes already had possession of Lake Katrine, were swarming along its shores, and ere morning sunrise would have covered the lawn once more with their white tents and spread their snares beneath the very windows of the Willie mansion. Withal, as the Brownies had learned to take such destiny as befell them with contented, or at least submissive minds, they composed themselves for the night's rest, and soon were sound asleep. The sentinels paced the parapets of the forts, peeped through the fog from the lookouts on shipboard, and stood watchful and silent on the lonely picket line beyond camp. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30. Of Old Farm Fairies. A summer campaign in Brownieland against King Cobweaver's Pixies. by Henry Christopher McCook. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Catherine Arwine. The Grand Alliance with SCALY, Twist, and SLYMOUSIE. Next morning, the Brownies' forebodings were found to be well grounded. Their enemies held possession of the lawn, lake and lawn, both in Pixie hands. It was a sorry day in Brownieland. What could be done? Not a word as yet had been heard from Ensign Law, and all were uneasy thereat, for they knew that he would not forget his mission, nor fail of it if success were possible, nor be likely to fall into the foe's hands. Yet his absence showed that early aid was not to be looked for from Governor Willie, and thus hope was cut off from that quarter. There were plans enough formed and discussed among the uneasy spirits of the camp, but only one had practical issue. Corporal Policy, of the Engineer Corps, proposed a grand alliance against the Pixies. The corporal was not in high favor among the Brownies, although he was a shrewd fellow, and a useful one too, when kept well in control by Sergeant True and the other officers. But in the present gloomy outlook of affairs, many were ready to listen to any counsel that looked toward delivering the nation from its peril and restoring the mansion to Brownie control. It is not strange, therefore, that the corporal's proposed alliance was seconded by many in the camp. A delegation, with Policy at its head, waited on Lieutenant McWhirlie, laid the plan before him, and urged its adoption. The plan was as follows. Policy had once done a great favor to two land elves, Twist, the serpent, and SLYMOUSIE, the quadruped, and also to SCALY, a water sprite. They had promised to serve him at any time in any affair. They were not on good terms with the Pixies at the best, and, the corporal urged, would be prompt and eager to fulfill their promise against the common foe. Now, continued Policy, I propose that we organize an expedition against the Stygians in this wise. Let SCALY fall upon their ships, sink as many as she can with the stroke of her tail, and drag the rest by their cables, or push them with her head upon the shore. Our troops and ships can attack them at this disadvantage with certainty of victory. At the same time, let Twist and SLYMOUSIE break in upon the Pixie camp and bite, crush, and destroy. SLYMOUSIE is a cunning and active adversary, and Twist is so much bigger than the Pixies that they cannot stand before him. Then there is nothing like fighting these poison-breeding creatures with their own weapons. Poison to kill poison, say I, quoth Corporal Policy. Shrewdness to overcome cunning, that is true wisdom. Thus, and with many other arguments, Policy and his friends pressed their alliance. McWhirlie had little favor for the scheme, as it was contrary to Brownie nature and custom. But, in sheer desperation, he at last consented that Policy should take charge of a company of volunteers and try his plan, especially as he thought it could work no harm and would keep some restless spirits occupied. The volunteers were readily enlisted and pushed off hopefully to find the haunts of Dragon Twist, SLYMOUSIE the quadruped, and Sprite SCALY. Twist was soon found sunning himself upon a limb of a sapling that grew above the big stone under which he had his nest. When the party spied him, the corporal mounted upon the rock and sounded a note or two upon his bugle. Twist slowly lifted his head above the leaves, flung a coil of his tail around a twig, looked down, and at once recognized his friend. He hissed forth as pleasant a greeting as he knew how to give, listened patiently to Policy's request, looked wise, nodded his head in approval, and at once promised to do his utmost. I will keep faith with you, good fairy, he said, lisping out the words between tongue and teeth. You may depend upon me to crush out your old enemies, body, bag, and baggage. Whereupon he wriggled among the leaves and took an extra coil or two of his tail around the twig. Thanks, cried Policy. And now, when will you begin operations, and how many of us will you want to help you? Now. I will begin now, answered Twist. And as to aid, I ask for none. If a few of you would like to go with me to see my triumph over the Pixies,
come along. I shall make short work of it, and you can come back and sing my praises."
The corporal detailed a squad of his men to go with Twist and hurried away to engage the service of Scaly. The water sprite was not so easily found. Somewhere in the lake, close by the rocks of the cape, she had her favorite haunt. The Brownies swung upon the overhanging weeds and bushes and peered into the water, but could see nothing of her. Policy sounded his bugle in vain. At length, a water beetle of the family known as whirligigs thrust itself out of the lake and began capering upon the surface. "Hello!" cried the corporal. "Rip!" said the whirligig, skipping nearer to the shore. "Have you seen Scaly, the sprite, down below?" asked Policy. "And would you kindly tell us where she may be found?" "Aye, that I can, Mr. Brownie. But what could you do, even if I were to tell you? Would you go down to the bottom of the lake to speak to her? Ha ha!" The little water beetle, who had been joined now by a group of companions, cut sundry gyrations upon the lake and circled round and round in a merry dance with his friends. Clearly, he was much pleased that he was able to do something which a fairy could not do. "Come now, Master Whirligig," said the corporal. "You must oblige us in this matter. You know that Brownies are your good friends, and you know that we can't do what you can. Go and tell Scaly that we want to see her." "So I will," answered the water beetle good-naturedly. "So we will," chirped all his companions. Turning suddenly, the whole party plunged into the water, everyone carrying down with him on the tip of the abdomen a bubble of air to supply him with breath while underwater. They made their way straight to a stone of quartz whose crystallized sides glittered in the light that penetrated the stream. "Sprite Scaly! Sprite Scaly!" called the beetles in chorus, while they held fast to the rock with their claws. A form slowly lifted itself from the shadows under the edge of the rock and rose higher and higher until it was quite on a level with the top, whereon Whirligig and his friends sat. It was a fish, with silver white scales and red eyes. She floated in the water, which she lazily beat with her fins and tail, opening and shutting her gills, looking all the while very sedate indeed. "Sprite Scaly! Ah, here you are!" cried the beetles as they caught sight of the fish poised above them. "Brownie, Policy, sent us down to tell you that he claims your service. He waits on the shore above. Goodbye!" Up they went without more ado, and in a moment were again circling around upon the surface of the lake. Scaly was not far behind them. Lazy as she looked, she could dart through the water like an arrow, and sooner than we tell it, had reached the bank and thrust her face close to the feet of the corporal. Policy repeated his plan and got as hearty assent from Scaly as from Twist. "What shall we do to support you?" asked Policy. "Well, there's nothing very special," said Scaly, spitting out half a dozen mouthfuls of water. "The Natties had better follow up my attack in their own way. They'll not have much to do but gather up drowned Pixies, I reckon, or maybe capture some of their boats as the Stygies make off from their damaged ships." The sprite and the corporal agreed upon the time for the attack, and thereupon Scaly turned, gave her tail a few self-satisfied flops, and dived out of sight. The third party to the proposed alliance was SLYMOUSIE the quadruped. "We shall find her in the field," said Corporal Policy, and sent off several men to hunt for her. The Brownies climbed the hill back of the mansion, and by found the cave, just on the edge of the orchard where Mrs. SLYMOUSIE had her nest. It was quite hidden away beneath the overtopping meadow grass. A round bunch of chopped and twisted hay was balled up within it, which made it snug and warm. The Brownies swung themselves down by the grass blades and roots until they were well within the cave, when the corporal called a halt and blew his bugle. There was much shrill squeaking down at the bottom of the nest, and a sudden rustling amid the dry upholstery as the youngsters scampered away into hiding. Once more Corporal Policy blew his bugle, and then called loudly, "SLYMOUSIE! Hello!" it's no one but I. The brownie. Hello? Come out and see the brownie." At last, a low, timid voice squeaked forth the question.
"Who's there?"
"Corporal Policy, the brownie. Don't you know me?"
"Oh, yes. To be sure, I know you now, but dear me, you nearly frightened me into a fit. I thought it was Grimalkin, the house cat, or that miserable old owl that nests in the hilltop wood. Are you sure it's only you?"
Yes, SLYMOUSIE. Don't be absurd. Who else could it be? I came to claim your help against our old enemies, the Pixies.
Dear, dear, don't mention it, I pray. What could I do against those dreadful creatures? It quite flusters me to think of it, indeed. Besides, I have a large family now at home, some of them very young, too young to leave alone. Really, you must excuse me this time. Dear, dear, my heart is going pit-a-pat at the very thought.
Policy was not to be put off so easily, and remained some time trying to persuade his friend, but he quite failed, and was about to leave when who should come into the cave but Master Biggie, Mrs. SLYMOUSIE's oldest son by the next to last brood. He had been out on a visit to his sweetheart, and dropped in to see if Mother hadn't a nice bit of cheese, or bumblebee bread, or some such delicacy for him. He heard enough of the conversation to excite his love of adventure, and at once volunteered to take his mother's place. "Do you think you are old enough to measure strength with the Pixies?" asked Policy.
"Old enough?"
exclaimed Biggie indignantly.
"Old enough indeed! Look at me now. I'm nearly as large as Mother, and not half so timid as she. Just you wait, sir. You shall see that Biggie SLYMOUSIE is no small affair when it comes to fighting Pixies. I'm a match for any score of 'em in strength, and as for slyness, well, you shall see."
Biggie was certainly a stout enough specimen of a half-grown SLYMOUSIE, and as he seemed not to be lacking in spirit, and had a keen mind for the work, his service was gladly accepted. It was arranged that he should attack the Pixie force in the rear, while Twist assaulted in front, and, having instructed him as to the time of assault and arranged some details, the corporal retired with his squad, highly elated at his success. Thus the Grand Alliance was formed. We shall now see what became of it. When the sun had gone down, the full moon rose. It poured a flood of rays upon the mansion, lit up the lawn, and lay like a golden crown on the top of Hillside. The Pixies were in high glee over their prospects. Their ships had drawn up around the inlet as near as they dared to come. Their troops had been ferried across the lake and were already closing up the lines of investment around the part of the Brownie camp which lay on the side toward the mansion. From this point, the Pixie tents and snares stretched across the lawn to the flower border by the walk. In this direction, Twist turned his course. He crossed the brook, holding his head aloft as he wriggled his body through the water. The Brownies followed on their moth ponies. The Serpent stopped a moment upon the shore, then dashed at the Pixie breastworks, which broke into fragments before his assault. Many of the guards were knocked over by the swoop of his tail. Others were crushed under the coils of his body. Others were pierced through by his sharp fangs. The camp was in consternation. A broad swath of fallen tents, broken fortifications, and dead Pixies marked the progress of the mighty Twist, and throngs of fugitives fled across the brook by a bridge that Tetragnatha had builded, and which quite reached from shore to shore. What a small affair serves to turn the tide of events at times. A little hop-toad, disturbed by the commotion, leaped from beneath a cool leaf to ask, "What's the matter?" "Aha, my beauty," cried Twist. "You're my game." And he snapped up Toady in a twinkling. One would have thought it a painful thing for Twist to eat his meals, for he writhed and jerked his body as though he were in torment. However, he appeared to grow more comfortable after a while, and stretched himself out on the grass as though to enjoy a nap. The Brownies were not pleased to see their friend the hop-toad dealt with so unceremoniously. The poor fellow and his brothers had stood by the fairies in many a stout bout with the Pixies. To be sure, the toads would eat their enemies, but as they never insisted upon sharing such rations with their friends, the Brownies made no objections. To have their new ally serve their old friend in this style was sad work, and their indignation waxed warm. But when Twist stopped short in his path and deliberately composed himself to rest, the Brownies could not restrain themselves. "How is this?" they cried. "Do you mean to leave off a work so well begun? Come, this is not keeping faith. Up and renew the attack. You will rout the whole Pixie army before sunrise if you keep on." "Thank ye kindly," drawled Twist, winking first with one eye and then with the other. "I never can work after supper. Must take time to digest. Shan't do anything till morrow. Going to sleep right here. Good night, sir Brownies. I'll finish job in morning." His head dropped down upon the grass. He was sound asleep. "Humph," said Corporal Spur, who had charge of the squad. "That ends this campaign. If the Pixies don't serve that gourmand with a rather peppery sauce for his supper, I'm out in my reckoning. Attention, squad. Wheel. Fly." He wheeled his own pony and led his little command back to their quarters. As they flew above the Pixie lines, they saw the camp alive with excited troops swarming from every quarter toward the spot where Twist lay. A squad of reckless youngsters who had jointly mounted the back of a huge Polyphemus moth could not resist the temptation to let fly a few arrows at the crowd of excited Pixies beneath them. One of the squad, our old friend Hijinks, narrowly lost his life, however, for in his eagerness he tumbled off the pony's back. Fortunately, Hassan seized one hand and drew him back safely, but it was a narrow escape, and even Hijinks was for a time quite sedate as he thought what his fate would have been had he dropped into the midst of that angry host of foes. In the excitement, Polyphemus came quite near the ground and barely escaped being lassoed by one of the vaulting legion. Meanwhile, a circle of Pixies had hemmed in the sleeping serpent, but no one dared to interfere with him until Spite came. Then they began to clamor for orders. "What shall we do, Captain?" "Do?" said Spite, fairly hissing the answer through his teeth. "Do? Why, we'll hang the villain." "Aha! Captain Spite talks very large indeed," whispered the soldiers one to another. "Who ever heard of Pixies hanging a serpent?" At any rate, Spite intended to try it now. Already he had climbed upon a bush that overhung the sleeping monster, had fastened a cord to a twig and dropped down upon his head. Twist moved. Spite retreated upon his cord, and in a trice was halfway up toward the twig. "Come back, Captain. You'll lose your life," shouted the crowd. "Tut! Trust me for that. Why, don't you see? The brute is dead stupid from his meal, and perfectly harmless." Down he ran again. This time, Twist did not move. Spite fastened a line upon his head, dropped down by the side of his face, and, burrowing into the grass, cleared a path directly under the jaws. Through this he carried his line, then up again along the opposite side of the face and knotted it. He had thus passed a cord entirely around the serpent's face. "Now, my braves," said he, "I have shown what I want you to do, and how to do it. Here, a score of you wind up these jaws until they are completely gagged. Another squad may take a knot in his tail. Tie it, lash it to a strong rope, and swing it up to that branch. I'll show you what more to do. Work sharp now, and touch the brute as gently as possible. We shall surprise him when he wakes up with a new suit of clothes. Hee hee." The Pixies and Pixies went to work with a hearty good will and soon had finished their task. Now, mount that branch and pull on the rope. The tail was raised a little, and then the work paused. Nothing more could be done in that way. "We must rig up a pulley then," said Spite. "Bring me a dead fly, quick." The carcass of a green fly was readily found. It was swung down from the branch and wrapped round and round until it became a hard silken ball. The rope, which had been tied to the tail, was now carried over this pulley, or windlass as it might be more properly called. The ball was slowly revolved by the united strength of a number of pixies. The rope gradually wound around it as it grew taut, and the body of Twist began to move. Thereat the crowd broke into hearty applause, clapping their fangs and claws together until the camp rang. The noise appeared to disturb Twist, or perhaps the effects of his meal were beginning to pass away. He raised his head feebly, shook it from side to side, discovered that his jaws were bound tightly together, and began to wriggle his body violently, whereat the circle of pixies fell back. "Pull lively, lads," cried Spite, who was prudently perched upon the top of the branch. "Lively! A few more turns, and we shall have him all right. There, that will do bravely. Now he may squirm as much as he pleases." Twist was indeed bound and hung up beyond hope of recovery, although he was making desperate efforts to escape. "Straighten out that cord, my lads, as much as possible," called Spite. "Run up supporting lines to the limb here. Fasten down the coils on the ball so that the rope won't give. Then, hurrah, we'll have a taste of dragon blood before we go to bed." Sprite ran down upon Twist's body as he spoke, and fastening himself upon the neck, struck with his fangs again and again. He then comfortably settled himself for a meal. In the meantime, a number of the working squad had followed their captain's example. Poor Twist! He was being literally devoured alive. Like many other wise persons, he had fallen a victim to ill-governed appetite. Thus ended his proud boasts, and the campaign most prosperously begun. A Brownie scout, attracted by the great commotion in the Pixie camp, stole through the lines and, discovering the cause, returned with the news which was soon known by all the Brownies at the inlet. But Spite was not long permitted to enjoy his well-earned supper. A runner bustled through the crowd and shouted for the captain. "Here I am," answered Spite, quitting his hold upon Twist's neck and dropping to the ground. "What's the matter now?" "Matter enough, sir. The rear of our camp has been attacked by young SLYMOUSIE, and everything there is in panic and confusion." "The prowling sneak! The Brownies have put him up to it, I warrant. Rally the men. We must try to drive him back." Thereupon, Spite started at full speed to the rear. He found affairs quite as bad as they had been reported. Biggie had cautiously approached the camp and, crawling low in the grass, slipped by the picket line undiscovered. Then, with a rush and bound, he leaped upon a group of Pixie sentinels who stood at the guard tent talking over the late incident with Dragon Twist. Unfortunately, his caution, which is a good trait, was pushed to an undue degree, which is bad practice in a soldier. The fact is that in spite of his boastings, Biggie's heart failed him a little when he came to face the danger, and thus his approach was so timid and slow that instead of striking the Pixie camp, as had been agreed, at the moment of Twist's assault, he did not attack it until Twist was fairly over his onset. This proved to be a fatal blunder. However, when he once began work, he pushed it vigorously enough. He dispersed the sentinels hither and thither, broke down their tent, and burst into the midst of the encampment. He struck, pushed and bit to the right and left, and soon had laid a broad swath of destruction along his path. In the midst of this high success, he came upon the scattered contents of a bumblebee's nest, which the Pixies had been pillaging. It was a most unlucky circumstance, for all the SLYMOUSIE tribe are fond of bee bread and honey, and Biggie was hungry. He stopped, smelled the bee combs, turned over a few cells with his nose, and then began to nibble. "Just one little taste," he said, "and then I'll go on with my duty." "Ah, Biggie SLYMOUSIE, take care. Your enemies are all around you. This is the time for duty, not for delicacies. Touch not, taste not, handle not. The temptation may prove too strong for you." But Biggie silenced the voice of his better judgment and nibbled away. Now, SLYMOUSIES are always dainty and deliberate in their way of eating, which, as a rule, is quite proper and nice. But when one is in the midst of a hard and perilous battle, daintiness cannot safely be indulged. Spite the Spy arrived on the scene just as Biggie had fairly settled down to enjoy a hearty meal. With a curse of thorough contempt hurled at the silly glutton, the Pixie chief began his preparations for revenge. He sent for engineers Tegenaria and Agalena of the Tubeweaver Legion, and ordered out Theridion and his pioneers. The Pixies set to work with a will, and ere Biggie had finished his meal, had completely surrounded him with a thick, strong, and high wall of webwork. While Biggie nibbled, the Pixies spun and wove around him their fatal snares. Poor Biggie. At last, all was ready. The Theridion pioneers were sent aloft among the overhanging grasses. The Tubeweavers went to their holes, and those in front of SLYMOUSIE provided themselves with silken blankets. Then Spite ordered a company of vaulters, runners, and sidegoers to the bushes behind Biggie. They moved to their places noiselessly and awaited the order to assault. It came at last. "Charge!" shouted Spite. Stridulans, at the same moment, struck the long roll on his drum, and the Pixies rushed in upon Biggie. The poor fellow was so frightened that he made a great leap forward. The Pixies, who had fallen upon him, were scattered in all directions. But, alas for SLYMOUSIE, he alighted within one of Tegenaria's thick snares. Immediately, the Tubeweavers closed upon him with their blankets, as Spanish bullfighters assail a wild bull. They blindfolded his eyes, covered his nostrils, and veiled his face until they were wrapped up as tightly as a captive grasshopper swathed by a big garden spider. Theridion and his lineweavers followed this attack and flung their swathing bands around Biggie's limbs. The poor fellow, in spite of his struggles, was soon wrapped up like a mummy and at last lay still and submitted to his doom. Spite rigged block and tackle and windlass, such as had been used to hoist twist. Then he fastened ropes to Biggie's tail and bade the Pixies pull away. Soon the unfortunate young SLYMOUSIE was raised aloft and hung by his tail, with his nose upon the ground. His foes surrounded him, pinched him, laughed, jeered, shot at him, until death came to relieve him of his tormentors. Thus, the second of Corporal Policy's grand allies came to grief. But the Pixies were not left to enjoy their triumph long. A runner ran into the circle and hurried to the chief's side. "What's in the wind now?" asked Spite. "Well, sir," said the runner, who was quite blowed and caught at his breath between the words, "there's the mischief to pay down at the lake. The Navy is all in commotion. The natties have got the help of Scaly the fish, and have broken loose upon our Styges with a vengeance. Scaly has already stove in 2 of our ships and a half-dozen boats. She is like to sink the whole Navy if we can't stop her somehow. The Admiral has sent for you." Spite was as near being overcome by this news as was possible for him, but he soon recovered. "Here, Pixies," he shouted. "Down to the beach, every one of you. This game will keep till you come back, if you ever do get back." He added in an undertone a remark that showed pretty clearly that he thought there was serious work before them. Matters did indeed have an ugly look when Spite reached the shore. The wrecks of 2 ships and several boats were floating in the water with Stygians clinging to them. Boats were pushing out from the remaining ships, bent on leaving them and seeking safety on land. 2 other vessels were standing out to sea, with all sails set, and the flagship Styx, followed closely by the Good Time, was slowly making for the shore. Spite took in the situation at a glance. "But what do the natties mean?" he asked. "They seem quite as much taken by surprise as our fellows. Saving a brace of boats yonder, there is not a Brownie ship under sail. Ah, there they go now. See those lights on the Emma? That's the signal to make sail. And there goes the signal to quarters. Oh ho, we'll have our hands full now, but I don't see through it. Surely Scaly the fish isn't operating on her own hook." The reader will understand Spite's perplexity. Most of the Brownies were indeed taken by surprise. McWhirlie had not even told Bruce and Rodney of Corporal Policy's plot. He had looked upon it simply as one of the madcap undertakings which his troopers were always ready for, and in which he liked to please them when he could do so, but that it would have any serious results never entered his mind. With the exception thereof of the volunteers engaged in the expedition, few were ready for action. But when the vigorous and successful raid of Scaly was seen by the clear light of the moon, the Brownies were all astir on lake and shore. The big Davids were double-manned. The ships made sail and prepared for action. At this point, Scaly turned her attention on the Pixie ships, Styx, and Good Time. Mindful of the wishes of her friend, Policy, she resolved to carry these vessels into the inlet as a present to the Brownies and as trophies of her prowess. She therefore darted between the shore and the ships, stopped the vessel's motion by running athwart their bows, then, placing her head first against one and next the other, pushed them by alternate shoves toward the mouth of the inlet, out of which the natties were slowly sailing. Scaly was in high good humor and made the lake behind her boil under the frisky strokes of her tail as she urged the Stygian barks forward. The Pixies were in despair. The Brownies, from the shore of the lake and the decks of their ships, sent up ringing cheers. Then came a sudden turn in affairs. The master of the Good Time, Wolf Strangle, was not a person to give up his ship without a struggle. He was a strong, active Pixie, a vigorous swimmer, fierce and brave. He made a desperate resolution. He would grapple with Scaly the fish, single-handed. He laid aside his sword, threw off his uniform coat and hat, and mounted the railing at the stern of the ship. The sailors gathered around him and waited silently to see what was his purpose. They would never have guessed the truth, but they knew their captain and were looking for something gallant and startling in which they expected to take part. This is what they saw. Scaly had just given the Styx a vigorous shove and turned to do the same service to the Good Time. She scarcely noticed the dark form of Strangle poised upon the railing, but thrust her nose under the stern of the ship, played her fins and tail, and sent the vessel merrily ahead. At this moment, Strangle leaped fairly upon her back, seized her with his claws on the forward side of the dorsal fin, and sunk his fangs again and again into the fish's flesh. Scaly wheeled to one side, leaped out of the water, and dived deep into the lake. Her whole frame was quivering with the pain and shock of the sudden assault. The Stygians on the 2 ships crowded the rails and ladders and gazed eagerly toward the spot where they had seen the 2 sink out of sight. They had great confidence in Commander Strangle, but they feared that, famous waterman as he was, he would be worsted in this combat. "He will be drowned," cried one. "He dives like a duck," said another, "and will come up all right." "No, it was madness to grapple with a fish many times his size, and in her own element," said a third. Now the voice of Admiral Quench was heard, ordering first all hands to quarters, and then to tack ship. The Stygies ran to their posts. The topmen flew aloft, and in a few moments both ships were turned about and under full sail from the inlet. Quinch had taken advantage of the diversion to put all distance possible between himself and the natties. Before this movement was finished, Scaly had emerged from the water. The black form of Strangle still clung to her back. The poor fish made the most frantic efforts to shake off her enemy, who held on as with a death grip. Scaly plunged under the sticks and tried to scrape off the pixie against the keel. Strangle swung his body over upon the fish's side, but never relaxed his merciless grasp. Frantic with pain and terror, Scaly swam round and round in circles, plunged into the water again and again, and finally, nearly worn out, dragged herself toward the shore and ran her head under the grass. Strangle held onto her body with his fangs, laid hold with his claws upon the grass stalks above him, and drawing himself up with his utmost power, had well-nigh succeeded in landing his huge prey ere Spite and his friends reached the spot. In a few moments more, the unfortunate Scaly was drawn up upon the green bank, where she was at once assailed by a brood of voracious pixies in the same manner as her unhappy ally, Twist, the serpent. Strangle quietly shook the water from his hair and perched upon a cliff together with Spite and other officers to watch the turn of events. The fate of Scaly had made a great change in the condition of the two fleets. The Stygians had been much scattered, but were beginning to rally. Their boats put back to the abandoned ships, carrying with them many of the sailors who had been picked up from the wrecks. The loss of the Stygians was 2 ships, several boats, and a few drowned sailors, but the victory over Scaly and the moral effect upon the Navy was counted a fair offset to this loss, and on the whole, the Pixies were mightily satisfied with the night's work. On the other hand, the natties had at once taken in sail and cast anchor. Some damage had been wrought upon their enemies by the expedition of Twist, SLYMOUSIE, and SCALY, but the defeat and capture of these mammoth adversaries, under circumstances that showed to such advantage the Pixies' skill and power, well-nigh demoralized the Brownies. Thrice that night had their enemies wrested victory from the jaws of defeat and had triumphantly annihilated the grand alliance of corporal policy. While the Pixies were highly elated, the Brownies were dispirited, cowed, well-nigh in despair. But courage, good fairies. The Hebrews had a proverb: when the tale of bricks is doubled, then comes Moses. The darkest hour is just before the dawn. End of Chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Old Farm Fairies. A Summer Campaign in Brownieland Against King Cobweaver's Pixies. By Henry Christopher McCook. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Catherine Arwine. Home again. Sightwell, the lookout on the Emma, had observed during the late stirring events a suspicious-looking craft hovering on the outer line of the Stygian fleet. It was a yacht, apparently one of the privateers or smugglers that infested the lake. When first sighted, it was hugging the shore, the side opposite the Pixie camp, as though planning a raid upon the Brownies encamped on that side of the inlet. When the Stygies had been scattered by Scaly's first onset, this yacht pushed boldly out from shore and headed directly for the inlet, as though she would come to the rescue of her friends. In the excitement of the closing incidents in Scaly's career, Sightwell had quite forgotten the stranger, but as the Emma came to anchor, he sighted her once more. She was bearing down upon the inlet under full sail. "Sail ho!" cried the lookout. "Where away?" called Ask, the mate. "Dead ahead, and bearing straight down upon us." "What do you make her out?" "A yacht. A smuggler, I judge. And, yes, there are 2 boats pulling along close under her sides." "That looks suspicious," said Ask. "Call the Commodore." Just as Rodney arrived on deck, Sightwell called from the fore topmast crosstrees. "Our boats are about to make an attack. I mean the boats that first went out with SCALY and afterward turned back shoreward. They pull up cautiously to the strangers. The 2 boats from the yacht dash away to meet them. They are about to grapple, No! What can that mean? The men in the boats rise and swing their hats. The yachtsmen are hanging in the rigging, swinging kerchiefs, scarfs, bonnets, and swords. I can see the flutter of one and the flash of the other in the moonlight. Hark! They are cheering each other." It was so, indeed. Over the shimmering surface of the lake rolled a volume of sound such as never before went up from so small a company in all the history of Brownieland. By this time, every soul on shipboard who could get aloft or find place at the railings was gazing across the water and wondering at this strange occurrence. No one could solve the mystery. Meanwhile, the lookout continued his report. "The whole scene is now fully in view. One of the Brownie boats is pulling for the shore with might and main. The other has left the yacht and is making straight for the Emma. The oars flash in the moonlight and are played so rapidly that the wake of the boat is an almost unbroken line of gleaming gold. The kind, Commander Takeheed, lies directly in the boat's course, and as the crew pass under the ship's bows, they pause a moment, only a moment, and then on again as though making a final spurt at a rowing race. But what is this? The whole ship's crew has surely gone mad. Cheer on cheer, wild, loud, uttering the very madness of joy, goes up from the kind's crew till the welkin rings. See? The flag is being dipped. The sailors are running over the rigging, carrying with them lanterns which they hang upon every available spot. The vessel is a blaze of light. They are manning the yards, and still the cheers rise up and roll over the lake with unabated energy. Ah, they have caught the contagion on the shore, which the first boat has already reached. A line of lights follows from the landing to the headquarters tent, springing up at once behind the running boatmen until every tent, bush, and treetop is gleaming with lanterns and torches. The fort is all ablaze, and such cheers! The camp is wild with joy over some great event. What can it be? Governor Willie has come, cried an enthusiastic Natty. Maybe, but we shall know in a moment. Rodney and his brave tars are well nigh beside themselves with excitement and wonder as the boat, on which every eye is now centered, dashes alongside. A brawny sailor is at the bow, necktie thrown off, shirt wide open, hatless and nearly breathless with excitement. Hist! The deck is silent as death, and every ear stoops for the message. The lost nurses are found. Faith, Sophia, they're on yonder yacht. Pipe, True, Blythe, they're all there, all safe. Hurrah! 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 Never were such echoes wakened from the green bosom of Hillside and the blue face of Lake Katrine as those which answered back the ringing shout. The tidings flew from ship to ship. Land and lake were soon gleaming with countless lights, and the very leaves above them shook with the sound of cheers and singing till the gathering dew dropped down from their quivering sides. And Rodney? We draw a veil upon his emotion as the tidings came to him. Equally, we drop the curtain upon the scene which followed when the Fringe, for it was Raff's yacht, the same that bore the nurses away into captivity, drew up to the side of the Emma, and Rodney sprung upon her deck and clasped his darling Faith in his arms. Presently, the yacht landed its precious cargo at the foot of Cape Home, where all the return party were publicly welcomed. Then the nurses were led away to their own tent and the embrace of their dear companions, Agatha and Grace. Faith and Sophia, safe in the midst of the Brownie camp once more. Surely the dayspring has come at last. All this time, Spite the spy stood upon the cliff, surrounded by his staff, all of them champing, fretting, cursing, wondering, guessing, well nigh distracted in their perplexity over these strange doings. The whole thing was so mysterious, the burst of joy on the part of the Brownies so sudden and extreme, that awe fell upon the Pixie host. Vague presentiments of coming evil hung upon many hearts. The troops lay down solitary and silent to sleep. Spite sat upon the cliff alone, looking at the moonlight upon the water, gazing across the mouth of the inlet into the illuminated camp of the Brownies, venting his hatred and disappointment in oaths, and weaving, in his busy brain, some plot by which to find out, ere he retired, the cause of his enemy's joy. He had already sent out scouts to prowl along the outer entrenchments of Fort Home, which divided the Brownie tents on the south side of the stream from his own. As he sat there, awaiting their return, he queried again and again, "What can it be?" "Ah, Spite, you shall find out ere long, and it will be the last tidings that your ears shall ever hear." We go back now to take up the story of the party upon Ellen's Isle and trace it to this happy ending. We left the little camp settled into happy sleep after the rescue of Faith and Sophia from Arachne Hall. The morning broke calm and bright, early driving away the mists that hung over the island. The first thought of all turned upon escape. It seemed beyond endurance to be shut up on that little spot, so near their friends, with such glorious news in their keeping. Faith, in particular, found it hard to restrain her feelings. She was indeed free, and her lover was by her side. But how could she wait for the hour when the load of grief should be rolled from her father's heart? But stubborn facts shut the party in. One boat, which had nearly swamped under the load that it had carried to the island, was all that they could command. And now there were 3 others, Pipe and the 2 nurses, to be cared for. The sailors asked to be left to shift for themselves, while the officers, and as many as could be stowed away safely, should make the best of their way to land. No, that would be selfish and couldn't be thought of. Besides, there was the risk. The Stygies were closely guarding the inlet, and the Pixie camp at Big Cave lay between them and the army. All over the lake and along shore the pirate crafts, smugglers, and yachts were plying. These facts made departure in an open boat too great a risk, especially with such precious passengers to look after. By themselves, no adventure would have been too daring for the humor of the wrecked Brownies, but, with Faith and Sophia in their company, they felt doubly engaged to caution. Then there was that mysterious boat's crew from the Doubt. The least imprudence might reveal to them the presence of the Brownie party and call down upon the little band the whole Stygian fleet. It was a perplexing position, and they must be wise and patient and make the best of it. "First of all," said Pipe, who now took command, "we must try to rig up another boat. Now, my hearties, out with your hatchets and ropes and get to work." The sailors could turn their hands to every sort of handicraft, and some of them were quite skillful mechanics. Fortunately, Square, the ship's carpenter of one of the sunken vessels, was among the number picked up by coxswain help, and to him the boat building was entrusted. First, the frame was made ready. A hickory twig was laid upon the ground and bent at both ends. This formed the keel. Both ends of 2 similar twigs were fastened to each end of the keel piece and bent outward to form the gunwale. These pieces were held in position by braces until the ribs were set, which were shorter twigs bent around the frame and fastened to the keel piece beneath and to the gunwale on either side. "Very good," said Square when this work was done. "Now for the covering. We must find a birch tree for that and strip the bark from some of the branches." The natties soon came back from the woods, bringing enough white birch bark to cover a man-of-war. The framework was entirely covered with this, the pieces being lapped far over one another so as to make the joints as watertight as possible. "Now," said Chips, as the sailors called the carpenter, "if we had a little oakum to caulk these seams, we should be all right." "We can fix that for you," answered one of the sailors. "Here is a grass whose fibers, if well scraped, will give us quite a good substitute for tow. As for tar, we can get on very well with the gum on yonder pine tree." "A good thought," said Square, "and I will leave you to carry it out while I get ready the thwarts and bottom boards." The thwarts were simply undressed twigs, laid close together after the fashion of a rustic seat and fastened against the ribs, and the bottom board was built in the same way. The whole affair had a rustic appearance when it was finished, but it promised to be serviceable, and that was the main matter. When the woodwork was done, the boat was turned keel up, and the caulking began. The fibers of grass were torn and drawn into fine threads, and these made passable oakum, which was thrust into the seams between the layers of bark until they were thoroughly stopped. Now, rollers were put under the keel, ropes were fastened to the stern, and by pushing and pulling, the boat was safely launched upon the lake. It floated well and was watertight. The building of the boat took the whole of that day and part of the following, and all hands were vastly pleased at the results. They now had the means to escape from the island whenever the way opened. After dinner, whilst Square wrought upon the boat, and Pipe and Blythe guarded the camp, True and Clearview, at the head of a small party, sallied forth to explore. They set out for the head of the island, that is, the end toward the inlet, marching as stealthily as an Indian war party. They were chiefly concerned to find out what the boat's crew from the Stygian ship Doubt had to do upon Ellen's Isle, and whether there seemed any prospect that they would pass over to the opposite end and thus imperil the Brownies. They had well nigh skirted the entire south shore before they observed any sign of the Pixies. "What is that?" cried Sailor Philip, pointing to a small conical mound just beyond the path, built of dry grass stalks and small twigs. Thereupon he ran up to it and exclaimed, "It is a tomtit's nest, built flat upon the ground." "Who ever heard the like?" shouted a companion, and thereat the Brownies began to guy the discoverer and ran into the thicket to get a closer view. "Well, well," they exclaimed as they got quite near, "it truly is a bird's nest of some sort, but what a weeny one! And what bird could have built it?" "Come, let us explore it," said a little Brownie, who, by a well-known rule of contrariness, was called Jumbo. So saying, he began clambering up the sides. "Good for Jumbo," his comrades cried, and followed close at his heels. It was easy climbing, and the Brownies, having quickly reached the top, were amazed to find no bottom to the nest. They looked down into a deep crater that pierced the ground below the surface and led into depths hidden in darkness. "I'm bound to solve this mystery," said Jumbo. "Who'll go with me into the hole?" He swung over the edge, and his comrades were about following when they were stopped by a sharp cry from Jumbo. "Look out there!" "Look in, you mean," said Philip, and they all looked into the burrow. They saw a row of gleaming eyes that sparkled like jewels as they slowly moved upward into the light. Then came into view a claw, then another, and next the brown head of a great pixie. "Whoo!" cried Jumbo. "Somersault all, and out of this, instanter!" He swung himself back over the outer edge of the nest and rattled down the rugged side in such haste that he tumbled in a little heap upon the grass and was presently buried under the sprawling limbs of his comrades. When the Brownies got to their feet, they saw a huge ground pixie of the clan Lycosa glaring at them over the edge of the nest and plainly getting ready to spring down upon them. "Cut and run, lads!" shouted Jumbo, and away the squad scurried out of the thicket, leaving Lycosa perched upon the crest of her nest-like tower. When they told their story to Captain Clearview, he bade 2 of the natties remain in the path and keep watch upon the nest-building Pixie, lest she might sally forth and attack the party on flank or rear. Then he bade the squad move on. They had gone but a short march when the captain called a halt. "See," he said, pointing toward the lake, "yonder is the boat. It is tied to the shore, without any attempt at concealment. Plainly, the crew has no suspicion of our presence here. Their camp can't be far away." The scouting party was halted, and Clearview and True stole through the young willows that fringed the shore. "Hist! There they are," whispered True, who had caught the sound of voices. "Do you see them?" "No, but they are just beyond this fallen sapling. Here, we can climb upon the trunk and overlook the bivouacs safely." In a small, open space, near the point where the boat lay, the camp had been pitched. A large tent with a tubular entrance had been built over the hole made by the uplifted root of an overthrown oak. Another tent was pitched above this on a platform made of earth, which had adhered to the projecting roots, and a third was woven over the top of a clump of weeds, its tubular entrance, or hall, running straight down to the ground. A bridge of silken ropes stretched from the camp to the tops of the willows that skirted the shore and from the tents to the edge of the water. It was a snug and pretty retreat. True and Clearview climbed into the branches of the fallen tree, crept along the trunk, and found themselves near enough to overlook the entire camp and overhear the conversation which had first attracted their attention. They were themselves hidden among the leaves. A sentinel stood in the circular doorway of the tent which occupied the hole below the roots. Just beyond, 2 Pixie officers walked to and fro, talking loudly and earnestly. "Do you know them?" whispered True. "Yes. That fellow in black is Halfway, the son of Hyde. He is one of the principal Stygian chiefs. The one in the brown uniform with broad, whitish band is Agalina Ringster. He is one of the tube-weaving Pixies, a tricky fellow and captain of the Marines." "Softly," said True, as the Pixies, having reached the limit of their promenade, turned and walked toward the tent. "We shall find out now what they talk about." "You are sure you understand your father aright?" asked Ringster. "Quite. He said that the cave was at the head of Arania Isle. Head, I think it was. It's the only point about which I feel uncertain. I am positive of all the rest." "But," said Ringster, "there is no such cave, for we have explored every inch of ground thoroughly. Pity the old man was cut off so suddenly. But we must act on your uncertainty and try the foot of the island. There's nothing else for it. You can't go to Spite about this matter. That would spoil all." "There's the trouble. We have wasted too much time already. Our absence will be noticed. We can't do much today, but will tomorrow be clear?" "Aye. Look at my Marines yonder. Do you see them putting up a new tent?" Ringster pointed to the tall grass near the willows, over which a fresh, silken canvas was being rapidly spread. "They never do that in threatening weather. You can rely upon it more certainly than our fine governor does upon his old probabilities." "But if we fail to discover anything on the foot of the island," asked Halfway, "can we take the time to go over the—" Here the voices of the officers grew indistinct, as they had turned upon their course and gone to the far end of the enclosure. They were soon within earshot again, but the thread of conversation had been lost. "But where is he?" asked Ringster. "If our search fails, we must fall back upon him. He was your father's friend and will serve you faithfully. Where does he keep his yacht?" "I don't know. But, I declare, I had quite forgotten it. He was to meet father here today." "Good!" exclaimed Ringster. "That is the best news yet. It was stupid enough in you not to remember it before. That makes matters plain. We may wait here until he comes and save ourselves all trouble. But where will he land?" I don't know that, responded Halfway. If I am right as to the location of the cave, he would touch here, of course. If not— Here, the Pixies entered one of their tents, and the conversation was wholly lost. We have heard enough, whispered True. Let us away. Noiselessly as they had approached, the Brownie spies stole back again to their friends and reported their discoveries. What do you make of it all? Asked Help. True answered, that scamp, Halfway, is after the cave in which Faith and Sophia were concealed. Don't you remember that they told us of Hyde's plans? The old rogue had been laying some scheme to circumvent Spite and was cut off before he had finished it or fully revealed it to his hopeful son. And the last part of the conversation? Refers to Raft beyond a doubt, answered Clearview. Now, the question is, what shall we do? These Pixies will be down upon our camp tomorrow at the furthest. We must get out of the island, at least out of our present quarters, very soon, unless, indeed, we agree to stand and fight it out. Well, said Help, I have thought of a plan that will save us from our greatest danger. I was sorely tempted to put it into execution while you were away. Look there, pointing to the Pixie boat. If that were out of the problem, we could solve it a good deal more readily. What I fear most is that these Doubtmen, at the first alarm, may pull off to the fleet and bring such a force against us as will overwhelm us. If they were here alone with us, we might have a fair stand-up fight, or a struggle of plot and counterplot, and come off well enough. Can't we get that boat adrift? It is not guarded. We can steal along the shore, loosen the cable, and let her drift off on the current. I will volunteer for the service. The party greeted this plan with approbation, and it was immediately carried out. Help and two of the sailors crept along the shore under the drooping boughs of the willows and reached the boat safely. Silently and quickly, they slipped the cable by which she was moored to the bank and, placing their spears against the bow, gave a vigorous push. The current was strong at this point, sweeping from the inlet along the head of the island toward the foot, and so out into the lake. In a few moments, the boat had drifted out of sight beyond the willows and was on its way to the outlet. It had immediately floated away beyond recovery before Halfway, who had mounted the bridge to look out for Raft, saw that the boat was gone and raised the alarm. He stormed, swore, questioned, threatened. In the meantime, Ringster had quietly ascended one of the tallest bushes and was carefully surveying the lake. I see her, he cried, pointing toward the outlet. Yonder she drifts, far beyond the foot of the island and out of reach. The current is so strong here that she has pulled up the stake or slipped her painter, and the current has carried her away. It's bad business for us, but storming won't mend matters. We must make the best of it and quietly wait for Raft. If he fails us, we must set signals for some of our own ships. So saying, he got down from his perch and entered his tent, an example which the rest were not slow to follow. The Brownies set their faces homeward, well satisfied with the results of the scout and anxious to reach camp before sunset. But their adventures were not ended. As the party stealthily threaded the shore in Indian file, Clearview, who was in the lead, suddenly halted and threw up a hand in token of silence. Hist! Softly! See there? He pointed to a gaily uniformed water pixie stretched upon the ground a little beyond them, sound asleep. The Brownie sailors lifted their spears and were about to hurl them at the prostrate form. Hold, said True in an undertone. We must capture this fellow. He may be Raft himself. It is his uniform at least, and, if it be he, no Brownie hand must harm him save in lawful battle. Let us move softly, and at the signal surround and capture him. It was done as ordered, and the sleeping waterman awoke to find himself in the hands of his enemies. Are you Raft Dolamede? Asked True. Well, what then, sir? Answered the Pixie defiantly. Then your life shall be spared for a kindness done in an hour of great need to those whom we love. The captive cast a keen, inquiring glance into True's face, then answered coolly, "Humph! That's a temptation to sail under false colors that most of my kin would thank you for. But I don't take kindly to lying, and don't ask for life at Brownie hands. Do your worst, and as soon as you please. My name's not Ruffed." Again, the Brownie spears were poised, and again, True interfered to save the captive. "Beat those bushes along the shore," he cried. "We shall carry our prisoner to camp." Presently, the sailors returned and reported that they had found a yacht at anchor under the willows just beyond. "Any name on her?" "Aye, the fringe is worked in white silk upon one of the sails." True turned to his captive and asked, "Are you the captain of that yacht?" "No, sir," was the stout answer. "The captain's looking for some messmates down yonder at the foot of the island." True started. "Haste! Mark the spot where the yacht lies. Bring on the prisoner. Away, away!" The Brownie camp was soon reached. Square and his squad left their boat building to stare at the new arrival and overwhelmed their friends with wondering questions. Faith and Sophia left their tent to learn the cause of the commotion. The crowd of sailors around the scouts and their prisoner fell back, bringing the Pixie into full view. Sophia uttered a cry and ran forward. "Do not harm him, True," she exclaimed. "This is Raft. Save him. He is the only one who showed us kindness in our captivity." Raft, for it was indeed he, cast down his eyes and said nothing. True looked in amazement upon him and asked, half angrily, "What reason, even according to Pixie policy, could you have had for telling us such lies?" Raft was silent. In sooth, he could hardly have answered the question. Perhaps he had felt, more keenly than he cared to show, Sophia's refusal to marry him. Perhaps he was moved by ideas of fidelity to his own party. Perhaps he was simply stubborn and defiant. Perhaps he was really ashamed, after the manner of some human beings, to confess and talk about anything so far out of his common life as a good deed. At all events, he refused to speak to anyone, even to the nurses. He was securely bound and carefully guarded throughout the night. Next morning, Pipe called a council and announced a plan of escape. "We have, or shall have soon," said he, "2 boats and Raft's yacht. We could get off quite well in the boats, but the risks of meeting some of the Pixie craft would be considerable. We can avoid that by taking out the fringe with us and pulling our boats close alongside of her. The Stygies will not suspect anything wrong with a craft they know so well. We can get quite near the fleet without challenge and trust to luck to run the gauntlet of the ships afterwards." The plan was accepted at once, and it was agreed to attempt the escape that evening, when the moon would give enough light to sail by, but not too much to allow close observation. There were 2 difficulties in the way: Raft and the Doubtmen. The first was happily disposed of. Pipe approached the prisoner in his hearty sailor fashion. He saw at a glance that the smuggler was in a better humor than on the evening before. "Mornin', shipmate," said Pipe. "We're going to leave these quarters this evening and take a little cruise toward the inlet. We have need of your craft for a convoy and want to make matters as easy for you as possible. We give you your choice. Stay here, tied to that tree until your friends at the head of the island can find and release you, or go with us on the fringe. If you choose the first, you must lose your yacht. If the second, we promise you that when we are safe alongside a natty ship or in the Brownie camp, you shall sail off unmolested. What say you?" Raft twisted himself into a more comfortable position, pulled upon the cords that bound him, and answered, "Well, bo'sun, I might as well say thank ye at once. I choose number 2. It's not a pretty thing for a free rover like me to be lashed up here like a sailor on a man-o'-war seized up for a flogging. And do you think I'd trust those fellows on the point to cut these cables and set me free? If it suited their own interests, they might. Otherwise, Raft might go to Pluto for all them. As to giving up the fringe—" Here a tear started into the smuggler's eye. Not if I can help it, Bowson. Why, I love that pretty thing more in my life. She's as dear to me as your daughter is to you. Aye, aye, sir. I'll save the fringe, bless her pretty timbers. So heave ahead, as soon as you're a mind to. One cruise with a Brownie skipper won't hurt, I reckon, especially as a fellow can't help it. That matter being arranged, the boat building was hurried up, and as the skiff was nearly finished, it was launched as already described. Camp was then broken, and the whole party embarked in the boats and pulled around the island, keeping close under the shadow of the overhanging willows, to the point where the fringe lay. Faith and Sophia were placed aboard the yacht, and Raft, still bound, was kept under guard in one of the boats. "Now, my hearties," said Pipe, as the Brownies landed, "we may as well get ready for some rough work. This is my plan. We are to go into ambush, just beyond there. I am satisfied that the Pixies will take this path to the foot of the island. The other side is well nigh a jungle, while here is an open way. You are to wait under cover until Halfway and his party appear. Then, at the signal, you are to open on them with spears and rush upon them with swords, making all the noise you can. I count, pretty confidently, that they will be thrown into confusion and will make straight back to their camp and fortify themselves. If they do so, we are all right and can sail away at our leisure. If they show fight, we must stand up to them like men and do our best." The ambush was soon arranged. A scout who had been sent forward to the point was seen swinging along under the bushes, stooping as he ran and moving noiselessly. He reported that the Pixies were about leaving camp and, as had been conjectured, by the path on that side. The word was passed along, and all sank into silence as Halfway and his command strode on carelessly, talking and laughing. When they reached the fatal spot, the boatswain's whistle rose shrill and loud from the bushes above the path. It was the signal of attack. "Faith, Sophia, and rescue!" The Brownies shouted this battle cry, which Pipe had given them, as though the voice and strength of 10 were in every throat. At the same instant, a volley of spears rained down upon the astounded Stygians, and, ere they could recover from their surprise, the natties were upon them with swift saber strokes. Pipe had reckoned truly. The surprise was so complete, the attack so vigorous, the names of the nurses, whom the Pixies were seeking, had such a startling effect as they were shouted and echoed on every side, and the Pixies were so utterly unprepared for defense that they turned at once and fled in disorder to their camp, where they began throwing up entrenchments. 3 of their number were left dead upon the ground, one of whom was their leader, Halfway, who fell, pierced through and through by spears which True and Clearview had hurled at him with sure aim. "Now, my lads," said Pipe, putting up his sword, "we may as well take matters comfortably until sundown. Then, up anchor and away home." A ringing cheer was the response. Sentinels were stationed, a scout sent out to watch the Pixie camp, and the party quietly rested until evening. When the moon arose above the lake, the anchor of the fringe was raised. The boats were manned, and the little fleet swung loose from the island. Both wind and current were against them at first, and little progress was made. But Raft, who had been released on parole and was aboard his beloved Fringe, aided heartily in navigating the yacht, while the boats kept close under her sides. Gradually, the party approached the inlet and arrived unchallenged within the lines of the Stygian fleet, just as Scaly began her attack. That event somewhat unsettled the plans of our little squadron, but Pipe soon found that it might work to their advantage. He crowded on all sail and made straight for the Emma, with what results the reader already knows. The Brownies dealt with Raft as they had promised, and when the island party had safely landed on the Emma, the smuggler was allowed to sail away with the Fringe, untouched. He made directly for Ellen's Isle, took aboard the Pixies there, secured the body of Halfway, and, after delivering the living and dead aboard the Doubt, ran his yacht under the cliff whereon we last saw Spite the Spy seated, waiting in solitude, tidings from his scouts. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Old Farm Fairies, a summer campaign in Brownieland against King Cobweaver's Pixies, by Henry Christopher McCook. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Catherine Arwine. Ensign LAWE'S Mission. Shortly after the renowned adventure with the Stygian ram, Ensign Law had been sent upon a mission to Governor Willie. He had been told to spare no effort to arouse the governor from his indifference to Brownie perils and sufferings and bring him to their help. "Take all the time you need," added Bruce, "and don't let us see your face until you can bring from Willie a fixed decision, yea or nay." These were hard instructions, but the ensign was used to facing difficulties and overcoming them too. He therefore rode away with a few trusty troopers, determined to succeed if success were possible. Arrived at the mansion, he found preparations afoot for a grand company in honor of the distinguished Major General Flesh. Many people had been invited, and when evening came, the house and grounds were thronged. There were Parson Pettyman and his wife, Senator Wirepole, the Honorable Mr. Splurge, M.C., Mr. Sherall, the rich banker, Mr. Shortweight, the wealthy merchant, lawyers Grip and Gab, Doctors Sugarcoat and Skindeep, Squire Muddle, Mayor Sponge, and Messrs. Taxam and Robb of the City Council. There were, to be sure, some most worthy people besides, but the above seemed to be the favorites with Governor Willie, and to them and the great General Flesh he showed particular attentions. There was no end of merrymaking. A band played beautiful music from a rustic stand in front of the hall door. Chinese lanterns hung upon trees and shrubbery, and these, with the light of the full moon, made the grounds look like a scene in fairyland. Amidst all this splendor and gaiety, the Pixies kept on spreading their tents upon the lawn. Every now and then, indeed, some of the company would overturn a tent and send its occupants fleeing into their holes among the roots. But that is a matter which Pixies count upon, and therefore they only grumbled and got to work again. Indeed, they were quite proud of the whole affair. "Ho, Brother Cito," said Captain Saltus of the skirmishers. "Isn't this a grand celebration of our victory?" "That it is," answered Cito, "a regular jubilee. Good luck to Governor Villy, and confusion to all Brownies." "Humph," growled Hetty. "They're a pack of human fools, and you're little better for thinking they care for our victories." "Let those laugh who win," thought Ensign Law, who was hidden in the rosebush just above the group, and overheard these remarks. "However, there will be little chance to forward my mission tonight. The governor has given himself up wholly to pleasuring that big general, and will have a heavy ear for Brownie complaints and petitions." He sat on the bush and swung himself to and fro, and listened to the strains of music, the hum of conversation, the clatter of plates and goblets, until the small hours of the night had come. Then he saw Willie and Dido go off wearily to their bedchamber, and wondered, "Shall I disturb them? No, I will wait until they are refreshed by sleep, and will appeal to them in the brightness of the new morning." As the day began to break, Ensign Law awoke. He peeped from beneath the leafy canopy under which he had slept sound and dry. Over the lawn, the white tents of the Pixies were spread far and wide. Squads and companies of busy workers were rapidly pushing on the encampment to the border of the south walk and to the promenade under the west window. "I can't stand this," cried the ensign. "Ho, Brownies, awake! Hi, ponies up! Shake the dew off your wings!" He leaped upon his own nag and, followed by his dragoons, flew across to the Virginia creeper that ran over the west wall and twined above the windows of the chamber where Willie and Dido slept. It was the ensign's hap to alight upon a leaf whereon a small and rather dainty but vigorous Pixie, named Madame Dictinia, the lace-maker, had built a snug pavilion. Spite had set her as an especial sentinel upon my Lady Dido, and when Law and his dragoons made such a rude entrance upon her domain, she was sorely vexed. Shaking her lace frills and skirts, she ran out from her tent and threatened the Brownies with high bluster and rage. But Law would not permit her to be attacked just then. He had other work to do, to which the lace-maker's presence only spurred him forward. The party left their ponies outside and crept through the slats of the closed blind into the room. They mounted the bedposts, climbed atop the carved headboard, and began drumming with their feet and spears upon the solid walnut. Rat-a-tat, rat-a-tat, tat-tat-tat. Neither of the sleepers stirred. "Louder, lads, louder," shouted the ensign. "Rat-a-tat, rat-a-tat, tat-tat." Still, the weary couple slept. "Stop," cried Law. "No use. Late hours, late supper, champagne. We must wait and try something better. Away." As they descended the bed and scampered back to the window, they were greeted by a loud, prolonged, nasal serenade from the unconscious pair. "Puff, puff, doo, ah," breathed Dido, quite gently, indeed, after a fashion which goes with some folks by the name of boiling mush. "Ooh, ooh, ah, ooh," was the answering snore from the governor's nose, with a tremendous force upon the hoog. In fact, it came out with such a sharp explosion that Willie's head flew forward and he awoke. "Wife," he said sleepily. "I say, wife." And here he gave Dido a little tap under the chin. "Don't snore so loud, please. Why, I... Really, you made a terrible racket. I thought at first that someone was pounding the bedstead." Dido was quite awake now and answered indignantly. "Snore indeed! You'd better talk. Pounding the bedstead, it's too bad." And thereupon the little lady turned over sharply toward the wall and composed herself to sleep. However, the governor had lost the benefit of Dido's speech, for ere she had finished he was sound asleep and snoring almost as vigorously as before. Meanwhile, the Brownies had returned to their rosebush retreat, ignorant of the amusing scene for which their little feet were responsible. "Tomorrow," said Law, "we must succeed. If we can once get the governor to see, in the early morning, while the dew lies upon their tent tops and reveals them what a vast camp of our enemies holds our old and rightful quarters, I am sure that he will clear out the usurpers at once." "Aye, but how shall we bring that about?" said Corporal Trust. "We must have help. Come, lads, mount and away," answered Law. He led his troopers straight toward the orchard. Over the treetops they flew, on, up, until at last he halted the party on one of the spreading limbs of lone aspen. There, the ensign dismounted, and approaching the lone aspen, the first object upon which his eyes fell was a round, horizontal snare of Ouroboros, spread within the hollow of the trunk, where the great gateway opened at the foot. His anger was highly inflamed at the sight, and he forgot his mission in the eager purpose to rout this foe lurking at the doorway of his friend, Madame Breeze. He ran hastily forward and smote the web with his sword until it fell to the ground. Ouroboros, who was stretched beneath it on a ribbon-like hammock, tumbled down with the ruins of his orb, and thereat Ensign Law fell upon him with his sword. But the Pixie, thinking discretion the better part of valor, dodged the strokes, and shaking himself loose from the fragments of his late beautiful net, ran away at top of his speed and plunged into the thick grass around the roots of the tree. Law did not think well to follow, and his wrath being somewhat vented, turned again to the errand on which he had come. He climbed the grass rope ladder stretched along the trunk, and having reached the upper window at the great knothole, blew a shrill blast upon his bugle. The echoes rolled up and down the hollow trunk. Ooh! 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 The round, mellow voice of Madame Breeze answered the call, and a moment thereafter the merry elf bobbed her rubicund face out of the window. Ah! Who is there? Brownies again, I warrant. Please! More forts to smash? Ho, ho, ho! Why, my sides are aching yet with that last bout. Ho, ho, hoo! It seemed more likely that the good lady's sides were aching with her hearty laughter. Didn't we batter them, though? She ran on. Down went tents, down went barricades, down went fort. Whew! Here, Madame gave one of her little coughs. Well, no, not exactly that, neither. That was too much for us, but no matter. The vile old den got its deserts anyhow. Ho, ho, ha! And how's Spite the Spy? Has his breath improved any? Please, dear me, I doubt if he ever scrubs his teeth. Think of a pure, sweet, breeze body like myself having to wrestle with such as he. Don't ask me to. No, no, it's too funny. Ho, ho, please, ho. You see, my asthma's no better. Please. All this time, the elf had been seated on a broad leaf, swinging like a pendulum, and gazing into the clouds. She suddenly stopped and looked into the ensign's face. Dear me, she cried. And so it's not Bruce this time, the rogue, the scamp, ha! Please, how could he dare to deceive me so? Whew! For 1 minute, Madame Breeze sat still. Actually, for a whole minute. The fact is, she was just a trifle afraid of Ensign Law, the only one of all the Brownies, by the way, who ever dashed her high spirits a particle. During that moment, the good elf looked as sober as she could, then threw her heels up and her head down and swung away furiously for a few seconds. Oh, it's you, is it? Well, things must be serious when Law comes a-gossiping to Madame Breeze. Well, well, cheer up, Mr. Sobersides. Shall we, inclined to sadness, strike melancholy's string? Oh, no, we'll tune to gladness and merrily, merrily sing. Tra-la! The elf trilled these words to a sprightly strain and wound up with a laugh, a wheeze, and a cough. By this time, her touch of seriousness had vanished, and she was swinging as lustily as ever. There now, Mr. Law, you see, I'm composed and ready for business. Go on with your story. Bad news? Of course. Yes, yes. Whew! I know something about it. Bad. There, stand still a minute, can't you? And go on. Law had stood silent and motionless all this while, waiting for Madame Breeze to settle herself. But as he saw that this was not likely to happen, he began the story of Brownie disasters, and, after many interruptions, reached the matter he had in hand. Yes, yes, I see it all, said the elf. Not another word. It is all right. Here, whirl it, keener. Put my ponies, Vesper and Vacuum, into the chariot. Quick! The word had scarcely been spoken ere the 2 pages returned leading a house martin and a meadow lark, who were harnessed to a maple leaf, mounted upon wheels of thistledown. The stem of the leaf served as the tongue of the chariot, and the palm of the leaf was bent over at the apex and bent up at the base, so as to make a very pretty fairy coach indeed. The lark's name was Vesper, the martin's Vacuum, and Madame Breeze had taken the liberty of nicknaming them Vesp and Vac. "Come, in with you!" cried the good elf, and suddenly, contracting herself into the very smallest compass, as she was wont at times to do, she bounced into the chariot. The ensign followed. Whirlet and Keener mounted the bird ponies and waited for the word of command. "To the cove! Go!" shouted Madame Breeze, and away the party went over orchard and meadow, over town, bridge, and river. They stopped at the summit of a hill that stands at the mouth of the cove, whose brow has been worn by frosts, heats, and storms of centuries until it stands up a bald cliff. The naked rock below has a rough likeness to a human face, and the fringe of bushes underneath gives the idea of a vast beard. The top of the cliff is covered with trees that look in the far distance like tufts of frizzly hair upon the giant stone's pall. From the midst of these rows, when these records were made, 2 pine trees. Their tall trunks were quite bare, their bushy branches interlocked closely, and thus was left a goodly-sized opening, through which, at that time of the year, the sun was first seen of mornings coming down into the valley. The fairies called this the Gate of the Sun, and it was to visit 4 sister elves who kept this gate that Madame Breeze had now come. The gate stood wide open, for the sunshine was already gone through the town and hills beyond. In a snug little cave in the limestone front of the hill, a sort of mouth to the giant stone's face, the 4 elves lived. Law followed as briskly as possible, swung himself from bough to bough of the overhanging shrubbery, landed upon a narrow ledge, and found his way to the mouth of the Cave of the Clouds. Madame Breeze, now expanded in bodily form to goodly size, had already entered and was bustling around the place, calling for the sisters. "Hi, Cirrus! Ho, Stratus! Here, here! Where are you? Wheeze!" The dead, dry leaves whirled around and around as the merry elf called, and the echoes answered her voice. "Oh, ee, oh! Cumulus! Nimbus! Can't you hear?" The bustling elf had no cause to be impatient, for she had scarcely spoken ere 4 forms slowly rose in the shadows of the inner cave and began to move deliberately toward the light. The first advanced with airy footstep, shaking about her face a cloud of long, curling locks, almost white. She was dressed in a white robe, covered with trellis-work patterns, inwrought with thin, silvery streaks. This was Elf Cirrus. The second sister was a plump, sober-looking elf, whose hair was gathered in woolly puffs upon her round head and was a curious mixture of white and black. Her robe was covered with figures of cones, hemispheres, and white-topped mountains, which figures were touched here and there with many bright colors. This was Cumulus. Elf Stratus wore a grayish robe, flounced with bands of diverse colors, many of them edged with bright silver and golden fringe, like the rays of the setting sun. Her dark hair was worn smooth and was crossed by a band of purple ribbons that girdled the crown. Nimbus, the last of the 4 sisters, was a gloomy-looking dame, with a kind look in her eyes nevertheless, and a great purse in her hand, through the meshes of which yellow pieces of gold were seen. She was dressed in black, had a gray cloak with fringed edges thrown over her shoulders, and a dainty lace cap upon her head. "Oh, here you are then," cried Madame Breeze as the elves came forward. They all bowed as she spoke, and stood quite still when she ceased. Indeed, the sisters seemed to be curiously affected by Madame Breeze's voice, for all the while that she was speaking, they gently swayed their bodies and moved back and forth through the cave. "Come now," said Madame Breeze. "You must be quite good-natured. You know, I have a very, very important duty for you. I want to serve my good friends, the Brownies. Please! Here, Ensign,
let me present you. These are the Cloud Elves."
Law bowed gravely, and the sisters each made that graceful and dignified courtesy which our grandmothers were taught to be the proper thing on such occasions.
"This is what I want," continued Madame Breeze. "Tomorrow morning, please, do you hear me? Tomorrow morning, I want to have quite clear. Keep the gate of the sun wide open. Whew! Wide, I say, for we have some good work for my Lord's soul to do over there at Hillside. Stratus, do you hear, lass? Please, I'm most afraid of you. You're such a regular night owl and affect the manners of those silly humans who wake all night and go to bed at sunrise. But mark what I say, please, you must stay at home this night. Not a flounce, not a frill, not a not a wheeze, nothing. Confusion, seize this cough. Of all your fine toggery must be spread between the sun and the gate tomorrow morn. Do you all understand?"
Madame Breeze puffed and bounded about in a nervous way, mightily stirred up by the necessity for making such a long speech. The sisters bowed several times, and at last Nimbus, who seemed to speak for the others, answered in a deep voice that rolled through the cave and sounded like low, distant thunder. "We will keep the gate open, good Mistress Breeze. You know we are always ready to oblige you. Your pleasure shall be our law."
"Good, good. Many thanks. Don't forget. If you do, bless your hearts, I'll blow up Brother Tempest and have him tear your fine robes into tatters. Goodbye. Come, Ensign, let us away, please."
Once more, squeezing herself into scant space, she got into the chariot. "Where next?" asked Law, when the top of the cliff had been regained.
"Where? Where? Jump in, quick! Whirl it, keener, you rogues! Where are you? Oh, you're at your posts, are you? Please! All right, go! Whew!"
"Go? Whither?" cried Whirlet, leaping upon Vesper's back and gathering up the reins.
"To be sure, I had forgotten, all owing to that vile asthma. To the falls in the cove, away!"
A beautiful stream runs through the cove. As it approaches the river, it hugs the base of the southern hill, enters a short ravine, midway of which it tumbles over a rock 10 or 12 feet high, making a pretty waterfall. The sides of the ravine, around the cascade and pool, are covered with ferns. Thrifty young hemlocks stretch their tops upward and interlock their green branches above. "What a charming spot! What a cool retreat!" cried Law, as the chariot dashed through an opening in the foliage, through which the sunlight stole and rested in a golden plate upon the bosom of the pool. The face of the pool was rippled and dimpled as Madame's chariot stopped upon a flat stone at the edge of the cascade. The waterfall, too, raised a louder splash and broke its broad sheet into many ribbons and tongues of water in welcome of the good elf. Vesper and Vacuum dipped their beaks thereinto, and having kissed the pool's face, threw up their heads and drank to the health of Cove Fall and its people.
"Wait a moment,"
said Madame Breeze. She leaped from the chariot and ran under the fall. Presently she returned, bringing with her the fairy Dew, whom she had come to see. Law had never seen a more beautiful and dainty sprite. Her face and head were covered with a long white veil, which, as well as her gauze robe, glistened with mimic pearls and diamonds. When she shook her head or moved her body, these jewels were thrown off in little showers that shone a moment in the sunbeams and then melted away into the earth or water. But there seemed to be none the less of them for all that. A curious instrument, that somewhat resembled Scottish bagpipes, hung from her shoulders and rested under the left arm. Every moment or two, Fairy Dew pressed this instrument between her arm and side, whereupon from a number of little tubes there would issue a cloud of spray that settled upon the grass and leaves in minute round jewels like those which covered the fairy's dress. Madame Breeze presented the ensign to the fairy, and then, in her own jerky way, told the story of the Brownies' troubles, whereat Dew was sorry and excited, and shook so many pearl drops around her that Law had to step beyond the circle of the shower to save himself from being drenched. That was the fairy's way of shedding tears, it would seem.
"What I want you to do," continued the elf, "is to be up bright and early tomorrow and cover the lawn at Hillside with those pretty gems of yours. The Pixies, bah, have their tents spread out like the camp of Joshua in the plains of Moab. Sprinkle 'em well, please. Make every single thread a string of dewdrops. We'll attend to the rest. What say you, my dear? Hoo!"
"Will the Cloud Elves be at home?" asked the fairy.
"Aye, I've seen to that. The way will be clear. What say you, please?"
"Oh, I must consult my husband first, you know. I can do nothing without Dewpoint. I'll run and ask him."
"Oh, you're as sweet as ever on that. Please, I'll be of yours. Quite, right. Go and consult with Dewpoint."
"May I go in with the fairy?" asked Law, who was curious to see her home.
"Oh, to be sure," said Dew,
"And welcome. Come in, both of you."
"Not I, thank you," said the madam. "Shouldn't wonder if I had taken my death of cold already. Whoo! In with you, ensign, and hasten back."
The water, in leaping over the edge of the precipice, left a space of a foot or more between the falling sheet and the face of the rock. By this path, Law passed under the fall. He noted that the light shone through the tumbling stream as through a frosted window and made every object within visible. Above him was a roof, and beside him a wall of rushing water, whose loud, steady roar, as it fell into the pool, quite drowned the sound of his voice. In a moment he was drenched with spray. The stones over which he stepped were wet and slippery, and compelled careful walking. Presently, Dew stopped before an opening in the rock and beckoned Law to follow her. He entered an irregular cave, which stretched backward into the cliff as far as the eye could reach. It was dark at first, but as soon as his eyes became used to the change, Law could see the objects around the opening, and faintly those further in. Upon the roof were hanging stalactites, white as sea foam, some tapering to points and dropping like icicles, some just touching or blending with like formations, called stalagmites, which rose from various spots upon the floor like marble pillars. These beautiful white formations were also spread over the walls of the cave wherever the water had trickled down, and some of them looked like serpents or roots of trees carved in marble. Far back toward the end of the cave, Law saw in the dim light an old-looking elf, who seemed to be in an uncomfortable state of mind and body. He was clad as scantily as propriety would allow, indeed, was naked from the waist up. A long white beard fell upon his bare breast. He sat upon a rude Gothic chair, not unlike the big pulpit seat which the minister sits in on Sundays, which had been formed, by some freak of the cave sprites, from the interweaving and massing of stalactites and stalagmites. He held in his hand a huge fan made from the feathers of a snowbird, with which he fanned himself so vigorously that his long beard was blown about over his chest, and his white hair was kept streaming behind him. Considering how chilly was the cave, Law thought this strange behavior. "Who is that?" he asked. "He looks like St. Nicholas in his summer retreat. Is that your husband?"
"Oh, bless you, no, no indeed," laughed Fairy Dew. "That is my half-brother, Frost.
He gets little comfort in this country until winter begins to come on. He hardly ever goes out of the cave the whole summer and keeps back there, as you see, in the coolest spot. No wonder that he plays some sorry pranks when he is released in the autumn from his long confinement.
But he has been out in the summer, hasn't he?
Yes, yes, said the elf quickly. He did escape the guards once or twice, and, dear me, I don't like to think of it. It was too bad the way he carried on. The face of the earth looked as if it had been boiled in a cauldron during the night. Farmers and gardeners were well nigh ruined. They called brother the Black Frost after that trick, though, dear me, I don't see why, for he's white enough, I'm sure, but mortals are odd and contrary folk sometimes. Just then, Dewpoint came out of a pavilion or chamber, which was contrived by using stalagmites as pillars and stalactites as supports. As he stepped forth, he threw back the curtain door and exposed the interior of a snug room, lit up with foxfire lanterns which were fixed in gnarled stalactite brackets. Law was about to take a closer view of this pretty room and its master when he heard the voice of Madame Breeze calling at the mouth of the cave. "Oh, hello there! Are you frozen up? Have you taken summer lodgings? Here, I've been waiting for
3 minutes, answered Law a little impatiently, for he was curious and disappointed. Then he bethought him of his duties and spoke up cheerfully. I am coming. You are quite right. It is no time to loiter. Thanks for your kind prompting, friend Breeze. Farewell, good Fairy Dew, and you, Sir Dewpoint, too. He hastened out of the cave and followed the elf to the chariot, which bowled rapidly away from the ravine. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Old Farm Fairies, a summer campaign in Brownieland against King Cobweaver's Pixies, by Henry Christopher McCook. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Catherine Arwine. How the mission ended. Whither now? Asked Law.
Home, said Madame Breeze. We've nothing more to do but wait for the morning. If all go well, and all shall go well, never fear, we will see old Spite, Faugh, and all his pixie crew, please, scattered to the four winds before morning. Be up bright and early. You shall find me on hand at daybreak, and by sunrise, Brownieland may proclaim a jubilee. Whew!
When the chariot reached Lone Aspen, Law called his troopers, and with many warm thanks bade the elf goodbye and hurried back to his former bivouac at the tip-top of the large rosebush. The ponies were tethered under the leaves out of Pixie's sight, and the troopers stretched themselves upon the branches to sleep or sat in the forks of the limbs and talked over old campaigns until nightfall. Always, however, sentinels kept watch against surprise. The day passed without alarm, and when night came on, the Brownies composed themselves to sleep. Law, full of anxiety, was sleepless. He had firm faith that Madame Breeze would bring deliverance, but, as she had not told her plans, he could only guess what they were from such hints as had been dropped while arranging matters with her friends. Still, there was so much doubt in his mind that he could scarcely compose himself to wait until the morrow. He descended the bush, dodging on the way the round, beautiful snares of the wheel legion swung among the daisies and the crisscross and knotted nets of the line weavers. On the ground beneath him, a party of Pixie officers were gossiping over current events. There was Saltus of the Vaulting Legion, a large-eyed, intelligent fellow dressed in a black uniform with gold and scarlet facings and a bright metallic green helmet and sword sheath. He was famous for his long leaps, being able to make, at a single jump, the distance of several 100 millimeters. There also were Lieutenant Hetty and Cito of the Wolf Battalion and Disdera of the Tube Weavers,
who lived in a sack-like tent from which the Brownies had nicknamed him Pixie Silkpoke. They were all in high feather and were making merry yarns and jokes over the late disasters which had befallen their enemies. Lieutenant Hetty was in the midst of a boastful prediction of the utter ruin of all Brownieland when a runner arrived with news of the strange excitement among the Brownies and the illumination of the camp and ships as related in a former chapter. "What can it mean?" asked Saltus. "No one knows," replied the runner. "Perhaps they've got up a big feed and powwow for some pompous general," growled Hetty. "Aha!" said Ensign Law, and, having doubled the guard, he sped away through the moonlight. When he came back with the glorious news of the rescue of the nurses, his squad of troopers could not restrain their joy and broke out with a round of cheers. "Whoo!" cried Ceto. "Brownies here as I live. After them, lads!" And he ran up the rose bush full speed. "Hey ho!" cried Saltus, leaping upon the leaves. "Mount for them, vaulters! Jump! Jump quickly!" "Confusion seize 'em!" growled Hetty between his teeth. "I'll put a stopper on your throats, my pretty chickadees." Thereupon he swung himself to a twig and followed his comrades. But Law had taken the alarm and betook himself and troopers to the Virginia creeper above the parlor window, where they were out of harm's way. Now the night passed merrily along. From the depth of despair, the ensign and his men were suddenly lifted to the height of joy. The news seemed too good to be true. Moreover, it was like a prophetic assurance of further good fortune on the morrow. Law's spirits rose to the highest pitch, and when at last he fell asleep, it was to dream of victory, love, and grace. "Oh-ho! Oh-ho! Did I surprise you, Mr. Ensign?" was the greeting which came to him as he awoke. It was daybreak. There sat Madame Breeze on the Virginia creeper above him, smiling good-humoredly and shaking the vine gently. He hurried to her side, bade her good morning, and told her the news of Faith and Sophia's rescue. Madame shook with joyful excitement until the vine clattered against the wall. "Hist!" she cried. "That will never do. Silence! Do you hear? Softly! Hush! We must keep cool a while longer. Wheeze!" She choked off her cough as she spoke and sat still, at least as still as she could sit. Law looked out upon the lawn. There was Fairy Dew, giving the finishing touch to her night's work. As she flew with quick wings above the grass, her arms played rapidly upon the sacks beneath them, and from the many tubes attached thereto, the spray flew in all directions. "Humph!" said the ensign, as he watched with curious interest this fairy spraying machine. "What a busy little body Fairy Dew must be! See what an immense work she has wrought during the night." "Aye, aye, that is what we want. Look how the dew brings out to view yonder pixie tents on the lawn and in the bushes. Ha ha! Good indeed. Wheeze!" The elf clapped her hands merrily at the sight, but Law could hardly enter into the pleasure of the view, for as he saw, almost every square foot of his beloved homestead grounds covered with the tents of his foes, showing white and clear under their load of dewdrops. His heart beat tumultuously with grief, shame, and anger. He therefore shrugged his shoulders and said nothing. "Never mind," cried Madame Breeze. "We shall see presently. Ah, look ye yonder. There comes the sun. All is well. Whew! Hurrah!" The first rays of the rising sun were beginning to peep between the two pines, touch the tip of the giant stone's pall, and shoot out across the river. "Bless the kind cloud elves!" exclaimed Madame. "They have served us truly and left the gate of the sun open wide. Welcome, welcome, good soul. Here, this way now. Fairy Sunbeam, follow me." The elf tossed herself off the vine and bustled away to the front window that looks toward the northeast facing the great bend in the Ohio River. She shook the window shutter until the slats rattled and fell open. "In with you now," she cried to the sunbeam. "Right in. Off the floor now, please. Up the white bedspread. There. That is it. That's it. Just the spot. Full and fair in the governor's face. Now, please, rest there a moment, will you? I'll finish up these shutters. Whew! Please." Puff! She laid hold of the green slats and shook them again and again. "Harder, madam, harder if you would get them open." Once more, the elf threw herself against the barrier until the window shook. "Here, Whisk, Keener," she called. "Come to my help. And you, Law, creep in here and pry up that catch with your spear. All together now. Woo, woo, woof!" One of the shutters flew back with a loud bang, and as good hap would have it, the hasp or catch on the end thereof struck the leaf on which Lacemaker the Pixie was nested and broke it loose from the vine. It floated off upon the wind, and Madame Lacemaker was sorely tossed about upon her aerial voyage. Seeing this, a fairy sunbeam seized the stem of the leaf and darted off westward with it. Thereat, Elf Keener plunged away after careening leaf and flying sunbeam, and with stout puffs of his breath drove the leaf before him. Madame Lacemaker all the while tumbling back and forth, holding on to the lines of her dainty web, and ever and anon from her kneeling or half-prone posture, shaking her fists and sputtering forth her helpless wrath. Now, through the open space, the sun sent in a broad sheet of golden light that fell full upon Willie's face. The governor awoke, rubbed his eyes, grumbled at the wind, grumbled at somebody's carelessness, got out of bed, and crossed the room to close the shutter. Madame Breeze threw around him the freshest and sweetest breath of the morning as he approached. He leaned out of the window to draw the taut shutter to its place. He was wide awake now. The soft sunbeams fell upon him. He drew a full breath and sent it forth again with an ah, ah, ah of hearty relish. "Well, this is a glorious morning," he muttered. "Ah, nature gives us our sweetest tastes of life after all. How still it is here, a real relief from the excitement and clamor of my life." He stood and gazed quietly upon the lovely scene before him. His eyes were fixed upon the rising sun, the glowing hilltop and golden-zoned river. A feeling of sadness fell upon him. It deepened into regret as he silently looked and mused. He was thinking, and who has not so thought, of the earlier, the purer, the happier morning of life, ere the ambitions and struggles of manhood had awakened within him to warm the heart to fever heat and taint the freshness and purity of nobler and holier desires and aims. "Hi-ho," he sighed, as he slowly drew the shutter to its place. He felt a light touch upon his hand. A small, thin voice, but very sweet and familiar, fell upon his ear. It was the well-known greeting of his Brownie friends. "Godspeed, Brother Willie. Hail and good speed." He looked down and saw standing upon the window-sill Ensign Law and his troopers. "Welcome, brothers. Hail and good speed," he answered. There was a heartiness in his tone and genuine pleasure in his face, which made the hearts of the fairies jump for joy. It was so like the tone and look of old time. "What do you bring me, brothers?" continued Willie. "What can I do for you, or what will you do for me?" "Look yonder, please," said Law, pointing toward the lawn. The governor leaned over the window-sill and followed the direction of the ensign's pointed spear. He started. The Pixie encampment covered the place. The dewdrops on the tent tops were glistening in the sunbeams like jewels. "Look out of the west window now," said Law. The governor threw back the shutter and saw the same dew-laden webs and silken tents stretching in close array up toward the orchard to the very bank of the lake and inlet. "And has it come to this, my good friends?" cried Willie. His voice trembled, and a tear started upon his cheek. "Have your old foes driven you from your homestead and shut you out from the mansion and from me? I see. Not another word. I know that it is my fault. Forgive me. I will right the wrong without delay. I will, indeed. And Dido will do her best to help me. Depend on us. When the sun has dried the dew from the grass, meet us at our old trysting place by the rose bush, and you shall see us scatter the pixies and give back the home lawn to my brownie brothers. Goodbye." He lay down again, but could not sleep. His thoughts were too busy with the past, and too sad, in sooth, to allow rest. He aroused Dido and told her all. Like a good wife, she heartily sympathized with him in his new resolves and agreed to join him in the crusade against the Pixies. Breakfast over, the two went out to the lawn. "Let the gardener bring up the lawn-mower," said Dido. "Not I," answered Willie. "I shall do the work myself. It is quite as little atonement as I can make for neglecting my old, true brownie friends." He threw off his coat, donned his wide-brimmed hat, and brought the scythe from the tool-house. The hone rung merrily upon the steel as the governor sharpened the blade. He had not forgotten his skill of earlier days, and while he was bringing the scythe to a good edge, his mind followed along the path of his life to the quiet village among the green hills on the banks of Little Beaver Creek, where his boyhood had been spent. One spot very dear to memory came into view: Aunt Fanny's farm. The good, strong face of dear old Aunt Fanny arose before him. What happy days he had spent in her quiet country home. He felt again the thrill of holiday freedom that stirred his young heart on those summer days when he set out upon the 4 miles walk to the farm. In imagination, once more, he passed the old factory dam. He saw the water tumbling over its breast. He stood on the Sandy and Beaver canal locks and watched Sam Underwood and Ike Clunk pull up their drip nets from the bays. With what eagerness of interest did he gaze when the net was swung ashore with a silvery sucker or a pink chub swaying down the center. On, along the Elk Run Valley. There is Orr's, and there is Meldrum's, and there is Charter's farm, and there is Kimball's mill, and there is Squire Clem Crow's cooper shop, and yonder is Elkton. 1 mile more. The road turns here to the left, winds down the deep cleft of Pine Hollow, shady the whole summer long between its sharp ridges crowned with hemlocks, and musical with the ripple of its clear mountain run. There is the old district schoolhouse, and many a lusty conflict he recalls with the country lads who waged with him the traditional feud between country hawbucks and town boys. Now he climbs up the hill road. There, to the right, is the Crow place, and the governor smiles as he recalls the easy, boyish wit that dubbed it the Crow's Nest. At last, through the trees, comes the longed-for glimpse of the white house on the knoll and Aunt Fanny sitting on the porch. Hurrah! She rises. She has seen me. Up the lane on a run now, and soon at rest before a bowl of snowy bread and fresh milk. What days those were, full of pleasure from early rising with the sun to twilight bed-going with the birds. The wanderings in wood and orchard, the expeditions after gay field lilies, aromatic calamus, and sweet myrrh, the long hunts after hens' nests in the fence corners, the walks, musings and amusings among the sheep and their frisky lambs, the cows and calves, the colts and piggies, the hens and their yellow puffy broods of muffies, the big roosters, the speckled guinea fowl. How keen was the zest of these engagements and pursuits. Then came the warm, bright days of harvest, and the mowers came with their scythes. What fun to toss the fragrant hay! What glorious fun to see the mowers run from the stirred-up bumblebees' nests! What fun, most glorious of all, to fight the insects with wisps of new-mown hay. Ah, the odor of the fresh-mown meadow on dear Aunt Fanny's farm. The governor seemed to smell it again, as fresh as on those long-past harvest days, while he stood there whetting his scythe and living over in memory the scenes of his bright, pure boyhood. He drew a deep sigh. He dropped the whetstone into his hip pocket. He threw back the scythe, then bent down to the grass, which had so long marred the lawn by its overgrowth, and swept a broad, clean swath up the hillside. "You shall not do the work alone," cried Dido, and seizing her reaping hook, began to trim away the struggling tufts along the border walk. When Ensign Law had received Willie's promise to break up the Pixie camp and disperse and destroy the Pixies, he straightway sent messengers to Bruce and Rodney to follow up the proposed attack. Swiftly but silently, the orders went forth. Fort Home, which commanded a point of the inlet nearest the mansion, was strongly reinforced, and the Big David, example, manned and made ready for use. The ships were cleared for action, the crews sent to quarters, and all things made ready for weighing anchor. Never did soldiers and natties await the command with a more cheerful, willing, and confident courage. The rescue of the nurses had given them new life. The good news of Governor Willie's conduct lifted them all into the height of hope. The battle cry was passed: Willie, Dido, and victory! All was ready. All were waiting. Now came a trooper, dashing post-haste into headquarters. "The governor has prepared his scythe and is just advancing to work." Then came a second courier. "The governor has begun the attack. Dido joins him in it." A third came. "Willie is cutting a broad swath up the lawn. The Pixie tents are swept away before him, and our foes are fleeing in all directions." Close upon this messenger came Law himself, spurring at topmost speed into the Brownie camp, swinging his sword around his head in high ecstasy, and crying, "Forward, all! Forward at once! Fall upon the foe, and we are saved and safe forever." "Forward!" cried Bruce. "Forward!" at the same moment shouted Rodney, and the signal flag flew to its place. The ships moved out under a favoring breeze and opened full broadsides upon the Stygian vessels. Ensign Law, once more at the head of his gallant troopers, led across the inlet and dashed at once upon the retreating Pixies. The footmen poured out of the gates of Fort Home and marched away to join the attack. The governor had now reached the bank of the inlet, and as he swung his scythe merrily and bowed to the good work, he was greeted with 3 times 3 from forts and ships. "Willie, Dido, and victory! Hurrah! Hurrah! Hurrah!" Willie paused a moment and swung his hat above his head, while Dido waved her handkerchief in recognition of the Brownie cheers. Then the governor turned and mowed down the lawn, throwing off at each swing of the scythe a bunch of grass mingled with the ruins of Pixie tents and huts, whose inmates lay struggling beneath the wreck of their homes, or fled to the standing grass, or burrowed and hid around the roots. The Brownies followed them up, searched them out, dispersed or slew them. It was a complete destruction and rout. In a few hours, the fragrant grass lay curling in the sun, and not a Pixie tent was left upon the lawn. Spite and Hetty made a strong effort to rally their soldiers and succeeded in forming a line of battle. But the Pixies were so demoralized that the troops broke and fled before the Brownie charges. Many found hiding places in holes and dens of the earth. Some escaped into the small boats of the smugglers and pirates. Numbers were taken aboard the Stygian ships and were borne down the lake, closely pursued by the natties. Lieutenant Hetty lay dead upon the field. What had become of Spite? When we last saw him, he was sitting alone upon the cliff, filled with rage and wonder at the Brownie rejoicings over the rescue of Faith and Sophia, and waiting in the moonlight for the return of the scouts whom he had sent out to get the news. Not a whisper of tidings could he hear. Bruce had ordered the Brownie pickets to keep the matter from their foes, and no breath of the good news could be gathered from them. For good and sufficient reasons, Raft, the smuggler, had held his knowledge secret and had kept away from Spite's presence. His yacht, the Fringe, was now anchored just under the cliff, hidden from view by the overhanging grass. Raft had heard for some time the commotion on the lawn, but gave little heed to it. It drew nearer. The swinging swish of the scythe against the grass, the cheers of the Brownies and Governor Willie excited his interest. He climbed up the cliff and reconnoitered. He took in the situation at a glance, then turned his eyes toward the inlet. There away, the natty fleet was underway and bearing down straight toward the cliff. "It's all up with Pixiedom," he cried. "For one good long while, at least. Goodbye to the lawn. I'm off with the Fringe to safe quarters. I wouldn't lose her to save the whole nation. Every fellow for himself, and deal take the hindmost. That's good Pixie doctrine, so here's cutting away." He spun out a dragline, Pixie fashion, and fastening it to a rock, thereby swung himself down the cliff to the grass at the water's edge. Thence he boarded the Fringe, set his sail, pulled up anchor, and was just about leaving the harbor when a shower of sand and small pebbles rolled upon him. He looked up and saw a Pixie officer lowering himself down the side of the cliff by blades of grass and ferns. The form seemed familiar. He looked more closely. Yes, it was Spite the spy. "Hold on! Hold!" cried Spite. "Aye, aye," answered Raft. "This way now. Down that tall rush. So. Now, swing upon the mast. There! You're safe, all right." He unmoored the yacht and, pushing against the cliff, sent her out with one vigorous shove into clear water. The wind caught the sails, and the Fringe flew merrily over the surface of Lake Katrine. Raft now had leisure to give some attention to his chief. Spite had thrown himself upon the deck and was fairly panting with fatigue and livid and trembling with passion. Wrath, terror, disappointment, shame were in turn and in quick succession reflected from his face. The smuggler had little love for the chief, but he pitied him now, and in his rough way tried to comfort him. "Better luck next time, Cap'n," he said. "We've had many a backset before, and have come out all right again. Cheer up."
"Backset indeed," growled Spite. "It's annihilation. There's not enough left of Pixiedom to make a decent funeral. But," and he rolled out a string of oaths, "I shall have such revenge as they little dream of. I'll tear the accursed nurses limb from limb and fling the pieces into the Brownie camp. Say, what are you putting her head down the lake for?"
he shouted, suddenly starting to his feet. "That's the way of safety, sir," answered Raft. "We must make for the outlet or Orchard Cave at once. Look there at the natties hard upon the wake of our fleet. We must get out of their way, sir."
"Curse the natties," answered Spite fiercely, "and confound you for a coward. Put her toward Ellen's Isle, I say. I will land there if the whole natty fleet were following us. But they'll not bother us now. They have better game at present than the Fringe."
Raft's cheeks burned at the word coward, and he could hardly refrain from tossing Spite overboard. But even the worst of pixies have some reverence for a chief, and Raft was one of the best. Besides, he really pitied Spite and was willing to allow for his bitter disappointment. He saw that he had not yet heard of the escape of the nurses, and resolved that he would tell him now so that he might be persuaded to give up the trip to Ellen's Isle. It was pretty hard to get started, however, with the story. Raft hemmed, stammered, and at last began. "Cap'n, there's no use going to the island now. All's up there as well." Spite interrupted him.
"No use? What is that to you? Do as you are bidden, and do not dare to question or comment upon my orders. Change her course at once, or...
He fairly screamed these words, and stopped suddenly in the midst of his threat, choked by passion. Raft trembled with anger. He dropped the helm, laid hold upon a marlin spike, and advanced toward the chief. Then he suddenly changed his mind and retraced his steps. "Very good," he answered quietly. "You shall have your own sweet way, my dear. Ellen's Isle it is." He pressed his tiller and shifted the sail. The fringe swung around, and in a few moments was quietly riding in one of the secluded harbors with which the smuggler was familiar, at the head of the island, and not far from the cave of Tigrina and Arania Hall. "Wait here until I return," said Spite, leaping ashore. "I shall be back soon." There was a strange look in Raft's eye that caught the chief's attention, for in a moment he turned back and, shaking his clenched hand at the smuggler, said, "If you fail me, I'll follow you to the ends of the earth and drink your heart's blood. If you prove true, you shall be admiral of the fleet. Beware." He turned again and was soon out of sight. "Admiral," sneered Raft when Spite had disappeared. "Admiral indeed. That sounds grand, verily, but I wouldn't stand the fury of his wrath and disappointment to be the chief himself. That is, even if—" Raft shook his head and glanced toward the cave. "However, he would have his own way, and he may find out for himself how much better it is than the one Raft advised." He pushed the fringe out of the harbor and, spreading full sail, ran rapidly toward the outlet. Let us follow Spite. He came to the door of the cave without noting any signs of the Brownies' recent camp in the neighborhood. He found the door fastened on the outside. What could that mean? "Curses on the old hag Tigrina," he cried. "She is out on some expedition and has left the nurses locked within. Well, they're safe enough under these fastenings," he muttered as he cut away the thongs. "And I'll have the Brownie beauties all to myself. But I'll flay the vile hag alive for this disobedience. It's time that I were rid of her at any rate." The strong fastenings which the Brownies had put upon the door were at length removed, and Spite entered the cave. All was still as the grave. Not a sound from the bright and busy world without fell inside these silent halls. He pushed on. The foxfire lights had burned out. He was well used to groping in the dark, but he could scarcely make out the objects before him. "Hello?" he called. The echoes of his voice rolled back upon him again and again from either end of the cave. A strange sensation came over him. His heart began to quicken. A cold chill seized him. He threw off the feeling. He cursed his timidity and superstition. "On! On!" he cried. "Revenge is near." He reached the silken curtain that formed the door of the fairy's room. He drew it aside, gloating over the thought of the terror which his sudden appearance would excite. A single lantern burned upon the wall, and by its light he saw that the room was empty. Signs of confusion were everywhere. The stand lay just where it had fallen, and under it the wisdom of the Pixies was outspread upon the floor. "Faith! Sophia!" he shouted. The voice died away among the arches. There was a faint noise at his side. He turned quickly. There stood Tigrina. Her face was gaunt, her cheeks hollow, her eyes burned like balls of fire. "Hag! Fiend! Wretch!" yelled Spite. "What have you done with the nurses?" He drew his sword and took a step toward the old Pixie. "Oh," said Tigrina, uttering a harsh, cackling laugh. "You have come at last, have you? The pretty nurses. Where are they? Ha, ha, ha. That is good, good. You didn't know that the Brownies had been here, hey? Didn't know that Faith and Sophia are safe in the Brownie camp, hey? Oh, no, that is very good, very. You didn't know that I had been left here, sealed up in the cave. Oh, no, not you." Spite stopped, then staggered backward as though he had been struck a violent blow. The whole truth flashed upon him. He understood now the mysterious outburst of joy in Brownie camp and fleet. Faith and Sophia were gone, safe from his power and revenge among their own friends. Fortune had failed him. His breast was torn by a tempest of passions. This last defeat was even worse than the loss of his camp and the rout of his army. He broke forth into wild, blasphemous reproaches of Tigrina for failing to keep the fairies in her charge. Again he lifted his sword, and again he started toward the Pixie. There was something in the attitude of Tigrina which caused him suddenly to pause. Her eyes shone in the dim light of the cave. Her sharp, long fangs swayed back and forth, touching each other with a grating sound. Her back curved. She sank into a stooping posture. Spite felt her hot breath strike his face as it hissed through her clattering teeth. He knew too well what all this meant. The blind fury had seized the Pixie. Fly, Spite, fly. It is for your life. He turns, flees. Too late. The rush of Tigrina's form is heard as she springs upon the doomed chief. Her fangs are fastened in his throat. He is borne down to the floor, and without a struggle and without a cry, he yields up his life. The enraged and hungry Pixie drank up his blood and left the dry carcass hung against the wall by broken strands of webwork to molder into dust with the silken ornaments of Arania Hall. Summer passed. Autumn came and hung her gaily colored banners upon the trees and shrubbery of Hillside. The Brownies dwelt in peace upon the lawn, and Governor Willie and Dido held the mansion with happier hearts than ever. The winds blew more and more keenly around the hills. The fall had well-nigh merged into winter. Thanksgiving Day came. Great preparations had been making at the mansion, and now the family meeting was being held. Gray-haired sires, strong men and matrons, and fair-haired children, down to crowing baby Paul, all were there. How the halls rang with merrymaking. What a happy, hearty company sat down to the Thanksgiving dinner. It was a bright, crisp day, and when dinner was over, all went out upon the lawn and gathered around the great rose bush. There was a quadruple wedding in Brownieland. Lieutenant McWhirly and Agatha, Adjudicant Blythe and Faith, Sergeant True and Sophia, Ensign Law and Grace, all stood up together and were joined in holy wedlock according to the simple rites of the Brownies. Then, amid shouts of the children, cheers of the older folk, and the wildest hurrahs of Brownies, soldiers, sailors, and people all, the 8 happy fairies rode away, escorted by a gaily uniformed troop, to the Lone Aspen, where Madame Breeze had prepared for them a grand reception. Fairy Dew and Dew Point were there, and the 4 sister cloud elves, and Whisk, Keener, and Whirlet, and before the merrymaking ended, even Elf Frost looked in, quite happy to be once more free to roam abroad. As the evening was fine and the moon full, Commodore Rodney and Pipe the boatswain arranged to give the party a reception on the Emma and a moonlight sail upon the lake. The sailors had beautifully decorated the ship. Foxfire lanterns gleamed from every part of the forts and shone all along the shore. Our old friends, Captain Ask, Help, Clearview, Mate Angel, Howard, Hope, Rise, Shine, the Twadeels, and many others were aboard. The wind was fresh, and the lake was a little rough, but that only made matters all the merrier. How the ship did scud along! It was passing the point of Ellen's Isle when suddenly a small vessel pushed out from the brown grasses at the water's edge, crossed the wake of the Emma within a stone's throw, and stood away toward the shore. "Sophia! Sophia!" cried Faith. "Look, yonder. Do you know that yacht?" Sophia glanced a moment at the beautiful vessel as it rose and fell on the waves and sped swiftly through the moonlight. "It is the Fringe!" she cried. "And there, see, there is Raft the smuggler. He has raised his hat. He is waving it. Hurrah! Hurrah! Perhaps had she stopped a moment to ask whether or not such conduct were orthodox in a brownie bride, she would not have done it, but she simply gave way to the impulse of her heart. She plucked her bridal veil from her head and, quite unconscious of what she did, waved it again and again at the fast-flying yacht. The Natties had sprung to their guns at the Fringe's appearance, prepared to pour a broadside into her, but when they saw Sophia's greeting and heard her shout, they took their cue from her and, instead of shot, sent cheers after the smuggler and his pretty craft. "Poor fellow," sighed Faith as she leaned over the rail and watched Raph's vessel disappear under the shadow of the shore. "Poor fellow. What a pity that he should be a pixie." End of chapter 33. End of Old Farm Fairies, a summer campaign in Brownieland against King Cobweaver's Pixies by Henry Christopher McCook.